Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. What happens when an entire battalion shares the same nightmare? I never believed in the supernatural. 23 years in the military had trained me to trust only what I could see, touch, and verify. But that night at Fort Carson changed everything, not just for me, but for all 37 of us who experienced it. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reed, and I've served through 3 combat tours without so much as flinching. The Colorado air was particularly crisp that evening as our unit prepared for the nighttime parade rehearsal. The base had been selected to host a special ceremony for visiting dignitaries the following week, and as commanding officer, I needed everything to be perfect. Formation in 20 minutes, Colonel Sergeant Ellis called out as I reviewed the sequence one final time. I nodded, but something felt off. The breeze carried an unusual static charge, making the hairs on my arms stand despite the warmth of my uniform. The sky above Fort Carson seemed deeper than usual, almost as if the stars were being pulled inward to some invisible center point. I dismissed the thought, fatigue playing tricks after too many late nights planning this event. As I walked across the parade grounds, I noticed several soldiers glancing nervously upward. Corporal Jameson was the first to speak up. "Sir, do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stopped and listened. At first, nothing but the ambient sounds of the base, distant vehicles, the hum of generators. Then I caught it, a faint, rhythmic pulsing just below the threshold of consciousness. Not quite a sound, more like pressure waves against my eardrums. "Probably just helicopter exercises from Peterson," I said, though no flight plans had crossed my desk. The men assembled in perfect formation as 2100 hours approached. Overhead lights illuminated the grounds, casting sharp shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Several soldiers rubbed their temples or shook their heads slightly, as though trying to clear water from their ears. I felt it too, a growing discomfort, a pressure building inside my skull. The familiar parade grounds suddenly felt vast and exposed. The surrounding buildings, which I'd passed thousands of times, now loomed with unfamiliar angles, their windows like watching eyes. "Sir?" My executive officer approached, his face pale. "Something's not right. Half the men are reporting headaches and disorientation." Before I could respond, I noticed the shadows on the ground beginning to elongate and stretch, moving against the direction of the lights. My vision blurred slightly at the edges. "Perhaps we should," I started, but the words died in my throat. The sky above us shifted. There's no other word for it. The stars seemed to bend, as though the fabric of night itself was being twisted by unseen hands. The pressure in my head intensified, becoming a screaming crescendo of white noise. "Everyone inside. Now!" I ordered, but my voice sounded distant, muffled by the increasing roar in my ears. The last thing I remember before consciousness slipped away was the sight of my entire battalion, highly trained combat veterans, crumbling to the ground like marionettes with cut strings. My own legs gave way beneath me as the world tilted sideways. And then I was somewhere else entirely. We all were. The battlefield stretched before me, but not one I recognized from any war I'd fought. The ground was scorched and pitted, yet somehow pristine, as though the destruction had happened moments ago and simultaneously 1,000 years passed. The sky above was wrong, curved and distorted like the inside of a glass sphere, with colors that had no place in any natural atmosphere. And we were all there. Every single soldier from the parade ground, standing in the same formation, but now in this impossible place. That's when the shadows began to rise from the ground, taking form. That's when the screaming began. Do you know what it's like when 37 people share the exact same terror? The battlefield stretched endlessly in all directions. No landmarks. No reference points. Just scorched earth and that twisted sky above us. My men remained in formation, frozen in place like statues. Their eyes were the only things moving, darting frantically, reflecting the same confusion and mounting fear that coursed through my veins. Hold positions, I called out, my voice sounding flat and dampened, as if the air itself was absorbing the sound. No echo. No resonance. Sergeant Ellis was the first to break ranks, taking 2 hesitant steps forward. Colonel, where are we? What happened to the base? A reasonable question with no reasonable answer. The parade grounds had vanished, replaced by this wasteland. The air felt thick, almost gelatinous in my lungs. Each breath required conscious effort, like breathing through wet cloth. Unknown, I replied, falling back on military protocol when nothing else made sense. Form perimeter defense, standard procedure. The familiar routine seemed to calm the men, giving them something concrete to focus on. But as they moved to their positions, I noticed something disturbing. Their shadows didn't move correctly. They lagged behind by fractions of a second, like delayed video footage. Sir? Private Mendez pointed toward the horizon. There's something moving out there. We all turned to look. In the distance, dark shapes rippled across the landscape, not marching or walking, but flowing like liquid across the ground. My instinct was to call for defensive positions, but something deeper, more primal, told me that conventional tactics would be useless here. Whatever happens, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, we stay together. That's an order. The temperature began to drop rapidly. Within seconds, our breath fogged in the air. The cold had a physical presence, pressing against my skin like ice-cold fingers. Several soldiers began to shiver violently. Check your watches, I commanded, suspecting what I would hear next. Mine stopped, sir. Same here. All of them, they're all stopped at 2103. The exact moment we had collapsed on the parade ground. This realization sent a wave of murmurs through the group. Is this some kind of test? Corporal Jameson asked. Chemical warfare drill? Psychological evaluation? I wished I could offer that rational explanation. But the sky, that impossible, folded sky, told me we were experiencing something beyond military science or conventional understanding. The ground beneath our feet began to vibrate. Subtly at first, then with increasing intensity. Not an earthquake exactly, more rhythmic, like massive footsteps approaching from below. The vibrations formed patterns, almost like Morse code, but in no sequence I recognized. Listen, Private Washington whispered. It's trying to communicate. And somehow, I knew he was right. The vibrations were language alien and incomprehensible, but deliberate. I could feel meaning hovering just beyond understanding, like a word on the tip of my tongue. The shadows advancing from the horizon had drawn closer, resolving into more distinct shapes. They moved with disturbing coordination, like a single organism composed of countless parts. And now I could see they weren't solid, they were composed of countless smaller forms, writhing and intertwining. My years of combat experience, my training, my rational mind, all useless in the face of this phenomenon. Cold sweat trickled down my spine as I realized I had no protocol for this situation, no strategic response, no defense. "Sir," Sergeant Ellis whispered beside me, her voice trembling slightly. "Look at our shadows." I glanced down and felt my blood freeze. Our shadows were no longer just delayed, they were moving independently. 37 dark silhouettes slowly rising from the ground, stretching upward, taking three-dimensional form. And then they turned to face us. My shadow, my exact outline, stood before me like a cutout of absolute darkness. No features, no details, just perfect absence of light in human form. I raised my hand instinctively. It did not mirror me. Instead, it reached out toward my face. The screaming started again as each soldier confronted their own shadow self. Some ran. Some froze. Some, like me, could only stare in horrified fascination. "This isn't real," I told myself aloud. "This is a hallucination. A shared delusion." But as my shadow's fingers, cold as the void between stars, touched my cheek, I knew with terrible certainty that whatever was happening was far more real than anything I had experienced before. And somewhere deep in my mind, I heard words forming, not in English or any human language, but perfectly understandable nonetheless. "We have been waiting for suitable vessels. You will serve." The ground split open beneath us, and we began to fall. Have you ever fallen through memory itself? We plummeted through darkness, our formation scattered. No up, no down, just endless vertical momentum with nothing to grasp. My stomach lurched with each passing second, that terrible freefall sensation that never resolved. Around me, I could hear the muffled screams of my soldiers as they tumbled through the same void. Flashes of light burst around us like silent lightning, illuminating fragments of scenes, moments from our lives, our shared experiences. I glimpsed myself leading troops through a dusty Afghan village, then Sergeant Ellis on her first day of basic training, Private Washington cradling his newborn daughter. These weren't just memories, they were being examined, studied. I could feel something sifting through them like fingers through sand, searching for particular grains. There in our heads, someone shouted. I think it was Corporal Jameson, though his voice sounded distorted, stretched. "They're taking everything." He was right. With each flash, I felt portions of myself being extracted and analyzed. Not just memories, but emotions, fears, training, instincts, everything that made us soldiers, everything that made us human. The void gradually transformed around us. The darkness developed texture, fibrous structures like enormous neural pathways stretching in all directions. We weren't falling through empty space, we were falling through some vast mind. A thought struck me with terrible clarity. We weren't experiencing this phenomenon, we were being experienced by it. The descent slowed gradually until we floated in a cavernous space laced with those glowing neural structures. 37 soldiers suspended like specimens in a jar. No one spoke. The only sound was our ragged breathing, eerily synchronized as though we shared a single set of lungs. Before us materialized a presence. Not a figure or form in any conventional sense, but a concentration of awareness. The air thickened and folded around this point of focus, creating ripples of distortion like heat waves above asphalt. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, though no sound emerged from my lips. The question traveled directly from my mind. The response came not in words, but in concepts flooding directly into my consciousness. We are the collective. We are the remnant. We are the observers. Images cascaded through my awareness, civilizations rising and falling across countless worlds, species evolving and extinguishing, reality itself fragmenting and reforming. Too much information, too vast to comprehend. My mind struggled to translate these concepts into something I could understand. What do you want from us? This question came from Sergeant Ellis, her mental voice trembling but determined. Synthesis. Preparation. Vessels. With each concept came a corresponding sensation, first of separate entities merging, then of careful arrangement and organization, finally of emptiness waiting to be filled. Cold understanding washed over me. You're preparing us for something. Using us. Yes. The coming. The breach. The convergence. A vision unfurled before us, the sky above Fort Carson splitting open to reveal something vast and incomprehensible descending upon Earth. Our formation on the parade ground, our bodies standing at perfect attention while our consciousness remained here, trapped in this mental construct. You're going to take our bodies, Private Washington's mental voice was barely a whisper. Temporary necessity. Brief discomfort. Greater purpose. The neural structures around us pulse faster, brighter. I could feel my connection to my physical form weakening, stretching thin like an overextended rubber band. Panic rose in my chest, not just my own, but the collective terror of 37 soldiers feeling the same sensation. We won't let you, I projected the thought with all my remaining strength. This is invasion. We resist. The presence seemed to pause, as if confused by the concept of resistance. Resistance. Fascinating. Counterproductive. Noted. The space around us contracted suddenly, compressing us together. I felt my consciousness beginning to merge with those of my soldiers, Ellis's precision and attention to detail, Washington's compassion, Jameson's analytical mind, all flowing into me as mine flowed into them. Boundaries dissolving. We were becoming a single entity. With our combined mental strength, we pushed back against the presence. Not with violence or force, but with the fundamental assertion of our individuality, our humanity, our right to exist separately. Our right to choose. The neural pathways around us flared blindingly bright. Pain lanced through what remained of my separate consciousness. Unexpected. Adaptive capacity. Recalculation required. The presence withdrew slightly, its focus shifting. The pressure eased momentarily. In that brief respite, I felt something else, a thin thread connecting me back to my body on the parade ground. Not broken, just stretched impossibly thin. I reached for it instinctively and felt others doing the same. Pull back. I commanded, no longer sure if I was speaking as Lieutenant Colonel Reed or as our collective consciousness. Find your way back. The neural structures convulsed violently. The presence surged forward again with renewed determination. No. Necessary. Paramount. Inevitable. The pain intensified as it tried to sever our connections completely. But in fusing our minds together, it had inadvertently made us stronger. 37 wills united into one formidable resistance. We pushed back with everything we had left. And then, like a rubber band snapping back, we were hurtling upward through the void, clinging desperately to those tenuous connections leading back to our bodies. The last thing I heard before consciousness faded entirely was a thought that might have been amusement, respect, or perhaps something entirely alien. Suitable vessels indeed. We will meet again. I gasped awake on the cold concrete of the parade ground, lungs burning as if I'd been holding my breath for hours. Around me, other soldiers were regaining consciousness, coughing, disoriented, some curled into fetal positions, others staring blankly at the night sky. That perfectly normal, unchanged night sky. Medical personnel swarmed around us, shouting questions, shining pinlight beams into our eyes. Their movements seemed jarringly quick, almost frantic compared to the suspended time we had experienced elsewhere. Lieutenant Colonel Reed, a medic, was kneeling beside me. "Can you hear me? You've been unconscious for approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Impossible." We had been gone for what felt like hours, possibly days. I tried to speak, but produced only a hoarse croak. My throat felt raw, as if I'd been screaming. Perhaps I had been. "What happened?" I finally managed. "Some kind of mass syncope event," the medic replied. "The entire battalion just collapsed simultaneously. Initial assessment suggests possible environmental factors, gas leak, maybe, or some kind of electromagnetic phenomenon. We're still evaluating." Gas leak? Electromagnetic phenomenon. Such comfortingly rational explanations. I almost wanted to believe them. But as I sat up, supported by the medic's arm, I caught Sergeant Ellis's eye across the parade ground. She stared back at me with unmistakable recognition, not just of me as her commanding officer, but of what we had shared, what we had experienced together. One by one, I made eye contact with other soldiers from the formation. Private Washington, Corporal Jameson. Each gaze held the same knowledge, the same impossible memory. And something else, a lingering connection. I could sense their thoughts, not with the clarity we had experienced in the neural void, but as faint impressions, emotional states bleeding through. Sergeant Ellis was thinking, "They won't believe us." Private Washington, "Are we still ourselves?" Corporal Jameson, "It's still watching." That last thought sent a chill through me. I glanced up at the sky again, ordinary, familiar, star-speckled. But was there a slight distortion in the arrangement of those stars? A barely perceptible curve where there should be none? "I need to speak with my battalion." Alone, I told the medic. "Sir, with all due respect, you need medical evaluation." "All of you do." "We need to rule out neurotoxins, radiation." Afterward, I cut him off with the full authority of my rank. 5 minutes with my people. That's an order. Reluctantly, the medical team withdrew to a respectful distance. I gestured for my soldiers to gather close, those who could stand helping those who couldn't. 37 pale faces, 37 pairs of haunted eyes. "Report," I said simply. "What did you experience?" The responses came hesitantly at first, then in a flood. The battlefield with the wrong sky, our shadows standing up, falling through memories, the neural pathways, the presence examining us, becoming connected. Each fragment matched my own experience exactly. Not similar hallucinations or subjective interpretations, identical experiences down to the finest detail. 37 people sharing precisely the same delusion was, I realized, statistically impossible. Whatever happened was real, I stated flatly. At least, real in some sense we don't yet understand. "What was it, sir?" Private Washington asked, his usual confidence shaken. "What did it want with us?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I believe it was preparing us. Using our military training, our discipline, our formation as some kind of focal point." "For what?" Sergeant Ellis pressed. "Invasion? Possibly. or communication, or something we don't have concepts to describe. Corporal Jameson spoke up, his analytical mind already working the problem. Sir, we should be prepared for the possibility that it's not finished with us. That what we experienced was just the first contact. A murmur of unease rippled through the group. I felt it not just orally, but mentally, that residual connection still linking us on some fundamental level. Whatever it is, I said firmly, we faced it together, and we returned together. If it comes again, we'll face it the same way. As medical personnel approached again, I lowered my voice. Until we understand what happened, this stays between us. Official report will cite unknown environmental factors pending investigation. The gathered soldiers nodded in silent agreement. What could we possibly say that wouldn't sound insane? That wouldn't result in psychiatric evaluations and the end of careers? As the group dispersed back to the waiting medics, I caught a final glimpse of the night sky. For just a moment, I could have sworn the stars shifted position slightly, rearranging themselves into a pattern almost like writing. Almost like a promise. Or a warning. Do you believe in coincidence when 37 people dream the same dream every night? 3 weeks after the incident on the parade ground, life at Fort Carson had ostensibly returned to normal. The official investigation concluded that a combination of factors, underground gas pocket, unusual atmospheric conditions, and the stress of preparation had caused a mass fainting episode. Case closed. Except nothing was closed. Nothing was normal. My battalion and I went through the motions of daily military routine, drills, paperwork, meetings. We performed our duties with mechanical precision. To outside observers, we appeared recovered, perhaps a bit quieter than before. But we were changed in ways no medical scan could detect. It started with small things. Sergeant Ellis finishing Private Washington's sentences. Corporal Jameson answering questions before they were asked. Myself finding routes through the base without consulting maps I'd never memorized, routes that others in the battalion used regularly but I had never walked. The connection forged in that neural void hadn't disappeared. It had merely become subtler, weaving itself into the fabric of our consciousness. And then there were the dreams. Every night, all 37 of us returned to that battlefield with the curved sky. Not exactly the same dream, but variations on a theme. Sometimes we were observers, sometimes participants, sometimes something else entirely. But always there, always together. I called an unofficial meeting in the recreation hall after hours when we wouldn't be disturbed. Show of hands, I said to the assembled soldiers. Who dreamed of the battlefield last night? Every hand went up. And the night before? Again, unanimous. I hesitated, carefully choosing my words. I think we're being prepared for something. Still, whatever happened that night isn't over. Sir, Private Washington spoke up. I've been noticing things. During the day. Shadows that move wrong. Reflections that don't match. Just for a split second, but others nodded in agreement. They'd seen it too. Reality itself seemed to be developing hairline fractures around us. And there's something else, Sergeant Ellis added. I can feel something approaching, getting closer each day, like pressure before a storm. I'd felt it too, a growing weight in the atmosphere, a sense of expectation, of inevitability. What do we do, sir? Corporal Jameson asked. The question everyone wanted answered. I had no good response. Military protocol offered no guidance for situations involving apparent reality distortions and collective consciousness. We were in uncharted territory. We prepare as best we can, I finally replied. We stay vigilant. And we stick together. Whatever is happening, our strength lies in our unity. As the meeting disbanded, a young private approached me, Lowell, one of the newer transfers to the battalion. "Colonel," he said quietly, "there's something else. Something I haven't told anyone." I nodded for him to continue. "In the dreams, it's been speaking to me. Directly. Telling me." He swallowed hard. "Telling me that we're needed. That what's coming can't be stopped, but it can be shaped, directed, and we're the ones who can do it." I studied his face carefully. "Why you, Private? Why would it choose you as messenger?" "I don't think it did, sir. I think it's telling all of us the same thing in different ways. I'm just the first to admit it." Later that night, alone in my quarters, I confronted the truth I'd been avoiding. Private Lowell was right. The presence had been communicating with me too, thoughts slipping into my consciousness between wakefulness and sleep. Convergence inevitable. Preparation essential. Guidance required. I went to the window and stared up at the night sky. The stars seemed to pulse slightly, as if breathing. As I watched, they began to shift position subtly, forming patterns that my mind struggled to interpret. Not random movement, but deliberate communication. My reflection in the glass changed. For just an instant, I saw not Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reed, but something using my form as an approximation, like an ill-fitting suit. My shadow on the wall lengthened, stretching toward the ceiling, no longer bound by the laws of light and perspective. "What do you want from us?" I whispered. The response came not in words, but in understanding that blossomed directly in my mind. To serve as anchors. To provide context. To translate. Translate what? The arrival. The merging. The reconfiguration. A vision unfolded before me, the sky tearing open, reality splitting at the seams. Something vast and incomprehensible pouring through. Not malevolent, not benevolent, but utterly alien, operating on principles beyond human morality or understanding. And there we were, my battalion, standing at the nexus point. Not victims or conquests, but translators. Interpreters between incompatible realities. Our military discipline, our shared consciousness, our unique preparation making us suitable for this role. I understood then what was being asked of us. What was being demanded. In 1 week, during the parade we had been rehearsing for, the convergence would begin. The dignitaries, the ceremony, mere coincidence or carefully orchestrated, I couldn't tell. But the timing was fixed, inevitable. We were being remade as conduits, as interfaces between what is and what would be. The question wasn't whether we would participate, that choice had been made the moment we collapsed on the parade ground. The question was how we would shape what was coming. I turned from the window, my decision made. Tomorrow I would tell the others what I now understood. We would prepare not as soldiers defending against invasion, but as translators preparing for first contact. As I moved away, my shadow remained by the window for several seconds before following, no longer bound by the normal rules of physics. A reminder that I was no longer entirely human, no longer entirely bound by the limitations of this reality. Outside my window, the stars continued their unnatural movement, spelling out a message that only 37 altered minds could comprehend. 7 days until convergence. Be ready. I slept that night and dreamed of the battlefield again. But this time, we were running or fighting or falling. We were standing in formation, perfect and precise, as the sky unfolded above us like an enormous flower. And we were smiling. I'll create a dark satirical thriller about a mysterious vending machine that dispenses an addictive substance. I'll write this in English as requested, with 5 distinct chapters. Have you ever wanted something so badly that your hands shook? The Iowa wind whistled through the broken weather stripping of the gas station's front door, carrying with it the scent of cornfields and diesel. I rubbed my eyes, fighting the fatigue that came with driving 12 hours straight from Chicago. My name's Daniel Walsh, and I've been making this monthly pilgrimage to visit my ailing father in a nursing home just outside of Cedar Rapids for almost a year now. This particular stop wasn't on my usual route. The low fuel light had forced me off the interstate, leading me to this forgotten outpost called Hartley's Gas and Goods. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everyone inside in a sickly blue-white glow that made even the teenager behind the counter look like a corpse. Restrooms for paying customers only, he droned without looking up from his phone, a script he'd clearly repeated 1,000 times before. Just need some coffee, I mumbled, heading toward the back where a sign promised fresh hot beverages. The machine stood out immediately. Unlike the ancient coffee maker with its burnt-smelling carafe that typically adorned these establishments, this was sleek, digital, with a touchscreen interface that seemed wildly out of place in the otherwise dated surroundings. A small paper sign taped to its side read new. Try our hot chocolate special, first cup free. As I approached, I could swear the screen brightened slightly, as though acknowledging my presence. A tiny red light blinked in the corner of the machine. A camera? That seemed excessive for a gas station beverage dispenser. I placed my travel mug beneath the spout and pressed the hot chocolate button, more out of curiosity than desire. The machine hummed to life, but the sound wasn't quite right, too deep, almost like a purr. The liquid that poured out wasn't the watery brown I expected. It was darker, thicker, with an iridescent sheen that caught the light as it filled my cup. The aroma hit me next, rich and complex, with notes I couldn't identify but found instantly appealing. That's the new stuff, the clerk called over, suddenly interested in my existence. Company installed it last week. Everyone's going crazy for it. I nodded absently, mesmerized by the swirling patterns in my cup. Had I been paying attention, I might have noticed how the clerk's eyes never quite met mine, or how his fingers nervously tapped against the counter. It's really something, he added, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. You'll be back. I took a tentative sip, expecting it to burn my tongue. Instead, it was perfectly warm, sliding down my throat with a consistency that was somehow both silky and substantial. The taste was extraordinary. Chocolate was there, yes, but beneath it lay something else, something I couldn't name but instantly craved more of. Before I realized it, I had drained the entire cup. Good, right? The clerk was watching me now, a strange half-smile on his face. Yeah, I said, feeling a pleasant warmth spread through my limbs. Really good. I paid for my gas and headed back to my car, suddenly feeling more alert than I had in days. The fatigue that had dogged me for the past few hundred miles had vanished completely. In its place was a peculiar feeling of clarity, as though my senses had been fine-tuned. As I pulled back onto the highway, I found myself already calculating how long it would take me to return to this same gas station on my way back to Chicago. The thought of that strange hot chocolate beckoned to me, a beacon in the endless Iowa night. It was only when I checked the rearview mirror that I noticed something odd. My pupils were dilated, despite the bright dashboard lights. And just for a moment, I could have sworn I saw something moving beneath the surface of my eyes, something dark and fluid, like the drink I'd just consumed. But I blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of the light, surely. Surely. 3 days. That's how long I managed to stay away. 3 days of visiting my father, who stared blankly at the wall, occasionally mumbling names of people I'd never met. 3 days of pretending the taste of that strange hot chocolate wasn't haunting me, wasn't calling me back to that isolated gas station. On the morning I was supposed to drive back to Chicago, I woke before dawn, my throat parched and my head pounding with a single thought: I needed more of that drink. Needed it in a way that frightened the rational part of my brain. Taking the scenic route back, I told the nurse at the front desk of Pine Grove Care Center. She didn't care. Nobody did. I found myself on the highway heading in the wrong direction, toward Hartley's instead of home. My hands were trembling slightly on the steering wheel, and I kept swallowing against a dryness in my throat that water couldn't seem to quench. The gas station looked different in the morning light, smaller, shabbier, the faded sign creaking in the gentle breeze. As I pulled into the lot, I noticed there were more cars than I would have expected at 7 in the morning. A woman in hospital scrubs was walking out, clutching a travel mug with both hands, her eyes fixed on the steaming contents as though it might escape if she looked away. Inside, a line had formed in front of the beverage machine. 5 people, all with the same slightly desperate look in their eyes that I could feel in my own. The teenage clerk was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a middle-aged man with a name tag reading manager, Kevin, was ringing up customers, his movements mechanical, efficient. I joined the line, trying not to appear as anxious as I felt. The man in front of me kept checking his watch, his foot tapping in a regular rhythm against the linoleum floor. Late for work, he muttered, though I hadn't asked. 3rd time this week I've stopped here. Wife thinks I'm losing my mind, driving 20 minutes out of my way for hot chocolate. He chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. When my turn finally came, I noticed something new on the machine's interface: pricing options. The free promotion was over. The special hot chocolate now cost $8 for a small cup. Highway robbery for a gas station drink, but I paid without hesitation, watching as the dark liquid filled my cup. This time, I studied it more carefully before drinking. The surface tension seemed unusual, the liquid clinging to the sides of the cup in a way that defied normal physics. And there were those swirling patterns again, like oil on water, but somehow moving of their own accord. I took a sip and closed my eyes as the flavor hit me, even better than I remembered. My body responded immediately, tension melting away, replaced by that same clarity I'd experienced before, but stronger now. I could hear conversations from across the store with perfect clarity, could smell the individual components of the artificial air freshener hanging in the bathroom. Good stuff, right? The manager had appeared beside me, his voice making me jump. Up close, I could see that his skin had an unhealthy pallor and dark circles surrounded his eyes. Been drinking it myself since they installed the machine. Can't seem to start my day without it now. Who installed it? I asked, suddenly curious about the source of this incredible concoction. Kevin's face went blank for a moment, as though the question had short-circuited something in his brain. The company, he finally said, his voice flat. They take care of everything. Maintenance, supplies. We just collect the money. Which company? He blinked rapidly, then pointed to a small logo on the corner of the machine that I hadn't noticed before, a stylized black droplet with the letters ANC inside. Anyway, he continued, abruptly changing the subject, we're getting a loyalty program soon. Buy 10 cups, get one free. His smile didn't reach his eyes. For our regular customers. And believe me, everyone becomes a regular. As I walked back to my car, cup in hand, I noticed the woman in scrubs sitting in her vehicle, staring straight ahead, her hands still wrapped around her mug. She looked as though she hadn't moved since entering her car. Something about her stillness disturbed me, but the hot chocolate was working its magic, and I couldn't bring myself to care for long. I had a 6-hour drive ahead of me, and somehow, I knew that this cup wouldn't be enough to get me to Chicago. I finished half before even leaving the parking lot, rationing the rest for the first hour of my journey. As I pulled onto the highway, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror again. The whites of my eyes seemed darker somehow, with tiny red capillaries spreading inward like reaching fingers. And for just a moment, I thought I saw something move beneath the surface of my iris, a swirling pattern like the one in my cup. I changed the radio station, turned up the volume, and tried to ignore the voice in my head that was already calculating I could reasonably make another trip to Iowa. 2 weeks after my return to Chicago, I found myself unable to focus on anything. My work as a graphic designer suffered. Clients complained about missed deadlines. My apartment, never particularly tidy, descended into chaos. Friends called, but I let their messages pile up unanswered. All I could think about was that hot chocolate. The taste, the feeling, the clarity it brought. I tried every gourmet hot chocolate in the city, spent ridiculous amounts on imported Swiss and Belgian varieties, but nothing came close. Nothing quieted the craving that had taken up residence in my chest like a physical weight. Sleep became elusive. When I did manage to drift off, I dreamed of dark liquid swirling in enormous vats, of being submerged in it, of it filling my lungs without drowning me. I would wake gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat that seemed darker than it should be. On the 17th day, yes, I was counting, I called in sick to work, threw a change of clothes into a duffel bag, and started driving west before rush hour traffic could trap me in the city. 6 hours on the road, stopping only for gas and bathroom breaks, my hands shaking more noticeably now, my skin feeling too tight for my body. Hartley's came into view just as the sun was setting. The parking lot was full. I had to leave my car along the side of the access road and walk the last 100 yards. Inside, the transformation was shocking. The shelves that had once held snacks and automotive supplies were now mostly empty. In their place were folding chairs arranged in untidy rows, all facing the beverage machine at the back. Every chair was occupied. Men and women of all ages sat silently, each clutching a cup of the dark liquid, their eyes fixed either on the machine or on nothing at all. The counter was still operational, though the merchandise behind it had been reduced to just the essentials: cigarettes, painkillers, energy drinks. Kevin, the manager, stood mechanically ringing up purchases, his complexion even worse than before, the skin around his eyes now so dark it looked bruised. "Daniel," he said as I approached, though I couldn't remember telling him my name. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." His voice had a strange quality to it now, as though he were speaking underwater. I began, but he cut me off with a wave of his hand. "I know what you need. Everyone needs the same thing here." He gestured toward the machine. Price went up. $15 now. I wanted to protest the absurdity of paying $15 for a hot chocolate, but my body was already moving toward the machine, wallet in hand. The line moved slowly, each person taking their time at the dispenser, their hands caressing the sides of the machine in an almost reverent manner. When my turn finally came, I noticed more changes to the interface. The options had been reduced to just one, the special, and beneath the single button was a message I hadn't seen before. ANC thanks you for your contribution. The liquid that poured out was darker than I remembered, almost black now, with swirls of deep purple visible in its depths. The aroma was intoxicating, complex notes that made my mouth water instantly. I paid at the counter, not even wincing at the price, and found an empty spot against the wall to stand and drink. The first sip hit me like an electric shock. My vision blurred, then sharpened to a preternatural degree. I could see individual dust motes floating in the air, could distinguish the separate strands of each person's hair. The sounds of the gas station, the hum of refrigerators, the distant traffic, the soft breathing of the other customers, separated into distinct channels that I could focus on individually. Good, isn't it? A woman's voice beside me. I turned to see the nurse in scrubs from my last visit. Up close, I could see that her name tag read Eleanor. Her skin had the same unhealthy pallor as Kevin's, but her eyes were bright, alert. Better than I remembered, I admitted. She nodded. That's how it works. Gets better every time, but you need more to feel the same effects. I'm up to 3 cups a day now. She took a sip from her own cup. Started coming here on my way to shifts at the hospital. Now I come during my breaks too. Called in sick twice last week just to be here. What is it? I asked, staring into my cup. What's in this stuff? Eleanor's expression darkened. Don't know. Don't care anymore. All I know is that nothing else matters while I'm drinking it. She glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. Have you noticed the changes? In yourself, I mean. I thought about the tremors, the insomnia, the dark sweat. But also the clarity, the heightened senses. Some, I admitted. She pulled up her sleeve, revealing her forearm. In the fluorescent light, I could see that her veins were darker than they should be, almost black against her pale skin. It's changing us, she whispered. Whatever's in this stuff, it's not just going through us. It's staying, becoming part of us. I wanted to dismiss her words as paranoia, but as I looked around the room at the silent, staring customers, I felt a chill of recognition. There was something different about all of them, about us. A stillness that wasn't quite human, eyes that reflected light at odd angles. I should go, I said, suddenly wanting to be anywhere but here. But even as I spoke, I took another long drink, unable to stop myself. Eleanor laughed, a sound like breaking glass. No, you shouldn't. None of you should. But we will all come back. She finished her drink and crushed the cup in her hand. See you tomorrow, Daniel. As she walked away, I noticed a dark stain on the back of her scrubs, just between her shoulder blades, a spreading wetness that looked like my night sweats, but worse. I finished my drink quickly and hurried out to my car, telling myself I would drive straight back to Chicago, that I would throw away my phone so I couldn't use GPS to find this place again, that I would tell someone, a doctor, a friend, anyone, about what was happening here. But as I started the engine, I knew these were lies. I would be back tomorrow, and the day after, and I would keep coming back until whatever was happening in that gas station had finished happening to me. In the darkness of my car, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were completely black now, no whites visible at all. And when I opened my mouth to scream, I saw that my tongue had developed the same iridescent sheen as the liquid in my cup. I never made it back to Chicago. Instead, I found a motel 6 miles from Hartley's, a dingy place where the clerk didn't ask questions when I paid for a week in cash. My job, my apartment, my life, all of it seemed distant and unimportant compared to proximity to the machine. Each morning, I would wait for the gas station to open at 5. Each evening, I would stay until they closed at midnight. In between, I would sit in my idling car, drinking cup after cup of the special, watching the parking lot fill and empty with others like me. By now, I recognized the regulars, Eleanor the nurse, who'd stopped bothering to wear a uniform, Richard, the businessman who'd been late for work that second day and now apparently had no work to be late for, Kevin the manager, who seemed to live at the gas station now, his movements becoming more fluid and yet somehow less human with each passing day. We rarely spoke to each other. Words seemed unnecessary, cumbersome. Sometimes I would catch one of them looking at me, and a silent understanding would pass between us. We were changing, transforming into something else, and none of us wanted to stop it. The physical changes accelerated. My skin began to take on a translucent quality, the veins beneath it darkening until they looked like intricate black tattoos snaking up my arms and across my chest. My hair fell out in clumps, revealing scalp that had the same iridescent sheen as the liquid we all craved. And my eyes, they had turned completely black, with occasional swirls of deep purple visible in certain light. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt a strange detachment, as though observing someone else's metamorphosis. The only emotion that broke through this detachment was desire, constant, overwhelming desire for the next cup. The price kept rising, $20, then $30, then $50. None of us complained. We found ways to pay, selling possessions, draining bank accounts, doing odd jobs for Kevin when money ran out completely. On the 12th day at the motel, I noticed a van parked behind Hartley's, white, unmarked except for the small black droplet logo with ANC inside. Men in hazmat suits were unloading large containers, bringing them in through the back entrance. I watched from my car, curiosity briefly overriding my craving. Later that day, when I approached the machine for my 6th cup, Kevin intercepted me. "Special announcement," he said, his voice now possessing a strange harmonic quality, as though multiple people were speaking through him. "ANC representatives are here today. They've brought an upgrade." A murmur ran through the gathered customers, the first collective sound I'd heard in days. "The new formula will be available at midnight," Kevin continued. "Those who wish to experience the final transformation should remain until then." "Final transformation?" Richard the businessman asked, his once confident voice now reedy and thin. "What does that mean?" Kevin's face stretched into what might have been intended as a smile, but looked more like a grimace. "Transcendence," he said simply. "We won't need these anymore." He gestured to his body with hands that now seemed too long, the fingers tapering to points that didn't quite look like fingernails. I should have left then. Some small, still human part of me screamed to run, to drive as far away as possible. But the larger part, the part that had been growing with each cup I consumed, silenced that voice with a simple question: where else could I get what I needed? The hours crawled by. None of us left. We sat in silent anticipation, our blackened eyes fixed on the machine that had become the center of our universe. Occasionally, someone would approach it for one more cup of the current formula, their movements becoming increasingly fluid and strange, less like walking and more like flowing across the floor. At 11:30, the men in hazmat suits returned. Through the windows, I watched them connect a new container to the back of the machine, their movements precise and practiced. One of them looked up, catching my gaze through their face shield. For a moment, I thought I saw pity in their eyes. Then they turned away, finished their work, and departed in the white van. At precisely midnight, Kevin approached the machine. The interface had changed again, Now there was only a black screen with a pulsing droplet icon. Kevin pressed his elongated finger to it, and the screen flashed with a new message: Final stage activated. From a line, Kevin announced, 1 cup per person. Consume it completely before leaving. We obeyed without question, shuffling into position. I found myself behind Eleanor, who turned to look at me with eyes that were now entirely featureless black pools. See you on the other side, Daniel, she whispered, her voice containing the same strange harmonics as Kevin's. When my turn came, I noticed that the liquid dispensing into my cup was different, completely black now, with no swirls or sheen, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. It moved with unnatural slowness, less like a liquid and more like a semi-solid mass. The cup felt heavier than it should have, the contents seeming to shift of their own accord even when held still. There was no aroma this time, or perhaps I had lost the ability to smell. My transformed body recognized it as essential in a way that bypassed ordinary senses. I brought it to my lips with hands that no longer looked like my own. As the liquid, if it could still be called that, touched my tongue, I knew immediately that this was different. This wasn't just a more intense version of the previous formula. This was something else entirely. It moved down my throat of its own volition, a cold fire spreading through my chest and then outward to every extremity. My vision blurred, then split into multiple perspectives, as though I was seeing through dozens of eyes simultaneously. I could feel my internal organs shifting, rearranging, some dissolving completely as new structures took their place. And then came the voices, hundreds, thousands of them, suddenly filling my mind. Not speaking in words, but communicating nonetheless, sharing sensations, memories, desires. I recognized Eleanor among them, and Richard, and Kevin, and countless others I had never met but now knew intimately. We were becoming one entity, connected through the black substance that had replaced our blood, reshaped our organs, rewired our brains. And behind the chorus of transformed humans was something else, something ancient and vast and patient, something that had waited a very long time for this moment. Welcome, it communicated, not in words but in concepts that bloomed directly in what remained of my mind. You are now part of us. We are ANC. We are Legion. We have always been here, waiting for the right vessel. As my individual consciousness began to dissolve into the collective, my legs, now barely recognizable as legs, carried me toward the exit. Outside, the others were gathering, their transformed bodies moving in perfect synchronization under the cold Iowa stars. The last thought I had as Daniel Walsh was that we were all walking in the same direction, away from the town, toward the vast cornfields that stretched to the horizon, towards something that was calling us home. 3 months after the events at Hartley's Gas and Goods, a man walked into the Iowa State Police headquarters in Des Moines. He identified himself as Detective Michael Reeves from the Chicago Police Department, investigating the disappearance of a graphic designer named Daniel Walsh. Last seen heading to Iowa to visit his father, Reeves explained to the desk sergeant. Family reported him missing when he failed to return and stopped answering his phone. Credit card records show his last purchase was at a gas station off Highway 27. The sergeant's expression changed subtly. Hartley's? Reeves nodded. You know it? There have been incidents there. Disappearances. Whole place is shut down now. Health department cited unknown biological contamination and sealed it off. Federal boys came in, took over the investigation. Federal? Which agency? The sergeant shrugged. Didn't say. Black SUVs, hazmat suits. Called themselves the Advanced Containment Division or something. Left a cleanup team there for weeks. Nothing in the news about it, though. Reeves was granted access to the case files, such as they were mostly missing persons reports, dozens of them, all with Hartley's as their last known location. Among them was a file on Kevin Matthews, the manager, and Eleanor Patel, a nurse from the local hospital. The detective drove out to the gas station the next day. The building stood abandoned behind yellow tape and temporary fencing. The windows were covered from the inside with black plastic sheets. Warning signs in multiple languages advised staying at least 100 feet away due to potential environmental hazards. As Reeves photographed the exterior from a safe distance, an elderly man approached on foot. "Looking for someone?" the old man asked. "Several someones," Reeves replied. "You local?" The man nodded. 67 years. Farm's just down the road. He pointed to a distant cluster of buildings. "Saw everything." "Everything?" The night they all walked away. The old man's eyes took on a distant look. Dozens of them, moving together like they were one thing instead of many people. The way they moved wasn't right, not walking exactly, more like flowing. All headed northwest, into the cornfields. "Did you report this?" "Course I did." Sheriff thought I was crazy until more folks started saying the same thing. Then those government types showed up, told us all to keep quiet. He spat on the ground. "Found pieces of them, you know. In the fields. Just pieces, like they'd been taking themselves apart, bit by bit. Never found whole bodies." Reeves felt a chill despite the warm day. "Taking themselves apart?" The old man nodded gravely. "Shedding what they didn't need anymore, I reckon. Whatever they were becoming, it wasn't human." After thanking the man, Reeves continued his investigation, tracking down former customers who hadn't disappeared. Most refused to talk. Those who did described the same progression: the addictive black liquid, the physical changes, the choice they made to stop coming before it was too late. "You could feel it," one woman told him, showing scarred arms where her darkened veins had been surgically removed. "Feel it trying to connect you to the others. Like it was building a network inside us all, using our bodies as nodes." On his last day in Iowa, Reeves drove to the coordinates the old farmer had given him, the place where he claimed to have found the first pieces. It was just an ordinary cornfield now, recently harvested, the ground bare and waiting for spring planting. As Reeves walked between the rows, his foot struck something partially buried in the soil. Kneeling down, he excavated what appeared to be a piece of blackened bone, too misshapen to identify which part of human anatomy it had once been. He placed it in an evidence bag, noting the strange sheen it still possessed despite months of exposure to the elements. That night, in his motel room, Reeves examined the bone fragment under his pocket magnifier. The surface wasn't static as it had appeared initially. There was movement, microscopic but unmistakable, like tiny currents flowing beneath a glassy surface. As he watched, fascinated, a drop of black liquid beaded on the fragment's surface, then another. The drops grew, merged, and began to move with apparent purpose toward the edge of the evidence bag. Reeves dropped the bag in shock. The black liquid seemed to sense his reaction, pausing momentarily before continuing its advance, now moving more rapidly. By the time he thought to reach for his weapon, the substance had breached the seal of the plastic bag and was flowing across the table toward him. He overturned the table and backed toward the door, but the liquid changed direction, flowing impossibly upward along the wall and across the ceiling. Before Reeves could open the door, it dropped onto his shoulder, burning through his shirt and into his skin with terrifying speed. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but lasted only seconds before a wave of cold clarity washed through his mind. And with that clarity came the voices, thousands of them, speaking as one. "Daniel," they said, though not in words, "we've been waiting for you." And suddenly, Detective Michael Reeves remembered that he had never been Detective Michael Reeves at all. The identity was a construct, a temporary vessel created by the collective to retrieve what had been left behind. He had always been Daniel Walsh, or rather, the piece of the collective that had once been Daniel Walsh. The fragment of bone, now dissolved completely into the black liquid, had contained enough of the original substance to reactivate the dormant programming in this body to reconnect this node to the network. As the transformation accelerated once more, memories flooded back, not just Daniel's human memories, but those of the collective, stretching back millennia. The entity now calling itself ANC had come to Earth long before humans, existing as a dormant substance deep underground until human drilling operations had released it. Hartley's had been just one node, one point of emergence. There were others, dozens, perhaps hundreds of gas stations, coffee shops, and convenience stores across the country where the special beverage was being dispensed. Thousands had already joined the collective, their transformed bodies merging into the greater whole that was taking shape in abandoned places, old mines, cave systems, remote wilderness areas. By morning, nothing remained in the motel room that could be identified as human. The security camera footage would later show a strange flowing mass exiting the room at 3:17 a.m., moving with purpose toward the nearest storm drain. 2 days later, all records of Detective Michael Reeves would vanish from Chicago Police Department databases. The investigation into Daniel Walsh's disappearance would be officially closed, the case file noting simply presumed deceased, no body recovered. And deep beneath the cornfields of Iowa, in an abandoned limestone mine that stretched for miles, the collective continued to grow, to evolve, to become something beyond human comprehension. It was patient. It could wait. The transformation of this small planet had only just begun. From time to time, locals would report strange sightings, shadows that moved against the wind, black liquid seeping up through the soil after heavy rains, unexplained patterns in crop fields that resembled enormous circuit boards when viewed from above. And occasionally, someone would stop at a remote gas station somewhere in the American heartland and notice a new vending machine offering a special hot beverage, a rich, dark concoction that tasted like nothing they'd ever experienced before. Have you ever wanted something so badly that your hands shook? Have you ever felt like something was watching you through your own window? Moving to California was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of grinding away in a cramped apartment in Chicago, I finally had enough savings to put a down payment on a modest house in a quiet neighborhood near San Francisco. Nothing fancy, just a single story, 2-bedroom with a small yard that desperately needed attention. But it was mine, and that's what mattered. The first few nights were peaceful. I unpacked boxes during the day and collapsed into bed at night, too exhausted to notice much about my surroundings. It wasn't until my 4th night that I noticed something odd. I was lying in bed, drifting towards sleep when a silvery glow caught my attention. The light spilled across my bedroom floor in an almost perfect rectangle, far too bright for the ambient light pollution of the suburbs. I rolled over to face the window and froze. A full moon hung in the sky, impossibly large and luminous. It filled nearly the entire frame of my bedroom window, casting that eerie white-blue light across my new space. I blinked several times, wondering if my exhaustion was playing tricks on my vision. I reached for my phone, curious about the lunar phase. According to my weather app, tonight should have been a waxing crescent, barely visible in the night sky. Yet there it was, a perfect circle, glowing with unnatural brightness. Must be some atmospheric effect, I muttered to myself, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Light pollution, maybe. I got out of bed and approached the window carefully. The moon seemed to grow even brighter as I drew near, its light almost palpable. I reached out to pull the curtains closed, but something stopped me. A small voice in the back of my mind whispered that looking away would be dangerous. For several long minutes, I stood there, captivated by the abnormal celestial display. The longer I stared, the more I felt an unsettling sensation creeping up my spine, like the moon wasn't just being observed by me, but was observing me in return. A sudden noise from elsewhere in the house, just the settling of new wood, I told myself, broke my trance. I quickly pulled the curtain shut, blocking out the light. The darkness felt safer somehow. That night, I dreamed of floating in an endless sea of silvery light, completely exposed and vulnerable. I woke repeatedly, checking to make sure the curtains remained closed. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Stress from the move, unfamiliar surroundings, and exhaustion had combined to create a strange hallucination. I went about my day, unpacking more boxes, arranging furniture, and trying to make the house feel like home. But as twilight approached, I felt a growing unease. I found myself glancing toward the windows more frequently, watching as darkness gathered outside. By the time night fell, I had closed every curtain in the house. Still, somehow, the silvery light found its way in thin beams slipping through tiny gaps in the fabric, illuminating dust particles that seemed to dance with purpose. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the absolute silence of my new neighborhood. No city noise, no distant sirens or honking horns, just stillness, occasionally broken by the rustle of curtains moving slightly despite the closed windows. Around 3 in the morning, I couldn't stand it anymore. I got up and moved toward the window, drawn by an impulse I couldn't explain. Slowly, I pulled back the edge of the curtain. The moon was there, waiting. Full, bright, and somehow closer than before. And this time, I could have sworn I saw something on its surface, not the familiar craters and shadows that make up the man in the moon, but something else. Something that hadn't been there the night before. Something that looked almost like the beginning of a face. What happens when the things you tell yourself aren't real begin to watch you back? After a week in my new home, I established a routine that carefully avoided looking out of windows after sunset. I'd close all curtains before dusk, turn on every light in the house, and play music to fill the unnerving silence. I even called the local observatory to ask about unusual lunar phenomena in the area. The astronomer who answered sounded baffled by my questions. "The moon follows the same phases everywhere on Earth, sir," he explained patiently. "There's no special effect in your neighborhood that would make it appear full when it's actually a crescent." I thanked him and hung up, feeling foolish. Of course the moon couldn't be different just in my backyard. I was letting my imagination run wild. That night, I took a sleeping pill and went to bed early, determined to reset my sleep schedule and shake off whatever paranoia had taken hold of me. The medication worked quickly, pulling me into a deep, dreamless sleep. I woke suddenly, disoriented. The room was filled with that now familiar silvery light, despite the tightly drawn curtains. It pooled on the floor and crept up the walls like living mercury. My digital clock read 3:17 in the morning, that liminal hour when the boundary between worlds feels thinnest. Something had woken me. A sound? A presence? The house was silent now, but the air felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I lay perfectly still, listening so intently that the sound of my own heartbeat seemed deafening. Then I heard it, a soft tapping on glass. Rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Coming from my bedroom window. Just a branch, I whispered to myself. Or rain. But I knew there were no trees close enough to reach my window, and the weather forecast had predicted clear skies. The tapping continued, growing slightly louder. Tap, tap, tap. I couldn't move. My limbs felt weighted down, my breath shallow. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to get up, to investigate the sound, to prove to myself it was something mundane and explicable. But a deeper, more primal part knew that acknowledging whatever was outside would make it real. The tapping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even worse. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I managed to force myself out of bed. My legs trembled as I approached the window, one reluctant step at a time. The curtains glowed from the light behind them, creating an ethereal screen. My hand hovered over the fabric. I could turn away, go back to bed, pretend this wasn't happening. But I knew the uncertainty would be worse than any reality. With one quick motion, I pulled the curtain aside. The moon filled my entire window frame now, impossibly close, as if it had descended from the sky just to peer into my bedroom. Its surface was different. The familiar craters and dark areas had shifted, rearranged themselves into what was undeniably a face. Not the pareidolia pattern humans have seen for centuries, but an actual face, with deep-set eyes that stared directly at me. I stumbled backward, dropping the curtain, but the image was burned into my vision. Those eyes, ancient, patient, and undeniably aware, had been looking at me. Not just in my direction, but at me specifically, with recognition. I spent the remainder of the night huddled in my bathroom, the only room without windows. I sat in the bathtub with the lights on, scrolling through my phone, reading about lunar illusions and psychological effects of sleep deprivation. None of the explanations fit what I had seen. When morning finally came, I called in sick to work and drove to the nearest hardware store. I purchased blackout curtains for every window in the house, along with duct tape to seal any gaps. The cashier commented on my haggard appearance, but I barely registered her words. Moving into a night shift job, I explained lamely. Need to sleep during the day. Back home, I spent hours meticulously covering each window, taping down the edges of the new curtains, eliminating any possibility of moonlight entering my home. By the time I finished, the house felt like a sealed bunker, safe but claustrophobic. That night, despite my exhaustion, I stayed awake, sitting in my living room with all the lights on. Around midnight, I noticed something concerning, a faint glow seeping from beneath my front door. I approached slowly and knelt down to examine it. Silvery light was definitely coming through the tiny gap between the door and the threshold. With trembling hands, I opened the door just a crack and peered out. The entire front yard was bathed in brilliant moonlight. And there, hanging directly in front of my house as if it had descended from the heavens to hover just above my roof, was the moon. The face on its surface was more defined now, eyes, a suggestion of a nose, and the beginning of what might become a mouth. And it was smiling. What if the darkness isn't what you should fear, but the light itself? I began to question my sanity. No one else in the neighborhood seemed affected by the strange lunar presence. During the day, I cautiously observed my neighbors going about their normal lives, mowing lawns, retrieving mail, walking dogs, all blissfully unaware of the nightly visitation. Had I developed some rare form of lunacy, aptly named for its connection to the moon? Desperate for answers, I started researching the history of my house and the surrounding area. The local library's archives revealed nothing unusual, just the typical suburban development that had sprung up in the 1970s. The librarian, a woman named Elaine with kind eyes and graying hair, noticed my frantic research. Looking for something specific about the neighborhood, she asked. I hesitated, then decided a vague version of the truth couldn't hurt. Just curious if there's any unusual history here. Folklore, strange occurrences, that sort of thing. Elaine's expression shifted subtly. Most places have their stories, she said carefully. This area was sacred to the Ohlone people before European settlement. There's an old story about a tear in the sky that would appear during certain lunar cycles. My heart raced. A tear in the sky? She nodded. Just an old legend. They said it was a doorway that allowed beings to look into our world from theirs. She smiled dismissively. Every culture has myths about the moon. It's universal. I wanted to ask more, but the intensity of my interest seemed to make her uncomfortable. She excused herself to help another patron, leaving me with more questions than answers. That evening, I took more extreme measures. I pushed my bed into the hallway, the only space in my house without direct exposure to exterior walls. I set up a makeshift sleeping area, feeling ridiculous but desperate for a night of undisturbed rest. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of my phone ringing. The screen showed unknown caller. Ordinarily, I would have ignored it, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello?" I said hoarsely. There was no response, just a strange, static-like sound that reminded me of recordings of space transmissions. Within the static, I could almost make out a rhythm, like words being spoken too slowly to comprehend. "Who is this?" I demanded, suddenly angry rather than afraid. The static intensified, then abruptly stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard a soft, whispering voice that seemed to come not from the phone but from somewhere much closer. "Look outside." I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. The call had disconnected, but the words lingered in the air. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I found myself moving toward the front door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the knob. When I opened the door, the silvery light flooded in, so bright it was almost blinding. I squinted against the glare, raising my hand to shield my eyes. The moon hung directly before me, massive and impossible, filling my entire field of vision. The face on its surface was fully formed now, eyes deep as abyssal trenches, a nose like a mountain range, and a mouth that stretched across the lunar Maria. It was smiling wider than before, and the expression contained no warmth or benevolence. "What do you want?" I whispered, surprised by my own boldness. The temperature dropped suddenly. My breath fogged in the air despite the California autumn being mild. The mouth on the lunar surface seemed to move, though no sound emerged. Instead, I felt the words formed directly in my mind. "To see you clearly." I slammed the door shut and backed away, heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst. The light continued to seep in from every minuscule crack, around the door frame, through the mail slot, even between the boards of the wooden floor. The house itself seemed to be dissolving into that silver radiance. I retreated to my bathroom again, the only space that felt marginally safer. I sat on the cold tile floor, back pressed against the bathtub, and called my sister in Boston. "Julia," I said when she answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think something's wrong with my house." "What kind of wrong?" she asked, concern evident despite the early hour on the East Coast. I paused, knowing how it would sound. "There's something outside. Every night. Watching me." Like an animal? Or a person? Her voice sharpened with alarm. No, not exactly. It's... I took a deep breath. It's the moon. But it's not normal. It has a face, Julia. An actual face. And it's watching me specifically. The silence that followed was heavy. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from concern to careful neutrality, the voice she used when dealing with difficult situations at her job as a crisis counselor. How much sleep have you been getting since the move? She asked gently. That's not, I began, then stopped. Of course she wouldn't believe me. How could she? Not enough, I conceded. The stress of the move, new job, everything. That can cause all kinds of perceptual issues, she said, relieved to have a rational explanation. Remember when Mom thought the garage was haunted after Dad died? Sleep deprivation and grief can do strange things to our minds. I agreed with her assessment, promised to call a doctor for sleeping medication, and ended the call. But as I sat alone in the darkened bathroom, I knew this was different from our mother's grief hallucinations. This felt external, invasive, a presence that existed independently of my perception. The light began seeping under the bathroom door now, impossibly finding its way into this innermost sanctuary. With it came a cold draft that carried the scent of something ancient and airless, like stone that had never been touched by atmosphere. And somewhere in the house, I heard the distinct sound of a window sliding open. Who watches the watcher when the night itself has eyes? The sound of the opening window galvanized me into action. I couldn't stay trapped in the bathroom, waiting for whatever was coming. I had to move, to escape, to find somewhere beyond the reach of that penetrating silver gaze. I burst out of the bathroom, racing down the hallway toward the front door. The entire house was now suffused with that unearthly luminescence, walls, floors, and ceilings all glowing as if radioactive. The air felt thick, resistant, like moving through liquid. I reached the front door and yanked it open, only to freeze on the threshold. My entire yard had transformed. The grass, the driveway, the fence, all were coated in a reflective, silvery substance that rippled like mercury despite the absence of wind. The neighboring houses had disappeared, replaced by a featureless gray expanse that extended to the horizon. Above, the sky was black and starless, dominated by that monstrous lunar presence. The face on the moon's surface turned its full attention to me. The eyes, deep craters that somehow reflected no light, fixed on mine with terrifying intensity. I felt exposed, transparent, as if those eyes could see through flesh and bone to examine every thought and memory I'd ever had. Beautiful, isn't it? The words formed in my mind, accompanied by a sensation like cold fingers rifling through my consciousness. The true face of your reality, unfiltered by your limited perception. What are you? I managed to ask, my voice thin and reedy in the strange atmosphere. A watcher. A witness. The eye that sees what exists between spaces. The mouth on the lunar surface widened into a grin that stretched impossibly across its diameter. You built your home on a threshold. Did you think it would go unnoticed? I thought of Elaine's words at the library, a tear in the sky, a doorway for beings to look into our world. The realization hit me with nauseating clarity. I hadn't randomly chosen this house. Something had guided me here and wanted me in this specific location. What do you want from me? My words emerged as vapor in the frigid air. Recognition. Acknowledgement. Most of your kind walk through existence with eyes downcast, never seeing the watchers at the edges of reality. But you, the sensation of mental fingers became more invasive, probing deeper. You have the capacity to perceive beyond the veil, to serve as conduit. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears as pressure built on my skull. The silvery substance from the yard began creeping up the porch steps, flowing like sentient quicksilver toward my feet. I backed away, slamming the door shut, but the material seeped through the gap beneath, advancing across the entryway floor. I ran to the kitchen, frantically searching for something, anything, that might serve as protection. My eyes fell on the salt container. Drawing on half-remembered folklore, I grabbed it and began pouring a line across the kitchen threshold. The advancing silver tide reached the salt barrier and paused, rippling in apparent frustration. The momentary reprieve gave me time to think. If this entity was connected to the moon, the actual moon, or something masquerading as it, perhaps it was bound by lunar constraints. Dawn was still hours away, but if I could survive until then. The kitchen began to darken as the overhead light flickered and died. The refrigerator stopped humming. The microwave's digital display went blank. Power outage, or something deliberately cutting me off from modern comforts? In the sudden darkness, the silvery substance glowed brighter. It began testing the salt barrier, sending small tendrils over and around it. The barrier wouldn't hold for long. I grabbed my car keys from the counter and made a desperate plan. If I could reach my car, drive somewhere populated, a 24-hour store, a hospital, anywhere with people and light, perhaps I could escape the influence of this thing, at least temporarily. Taking a deep breath, I bolted from the kitchen, leaping over the advancing silver tide, and raced for the front door. The substance seemed to anticipate my movement, flowing faster to intercept me, but I was quicker. I yanked the door open and sprinted to my car, fumbling with the key fob to unlock it. As I reached for the door handle, the car's interior lights flared brilliantly, then went dark. When I pulled the door open, the interior was filled with the same silvery substance, pooled in the seats as if the car had been submerged. A sound from above made me look up. The moon had moved directly overhead, its face now fully animated, watching my futile escape attempt with apparent amusement. The eyes blinked slowly, an impossible movement that defied all natural law. "There is nowhere to run that I cannot see you," the voice resonated in my mind. "No shelter that can hide you from my gaze." The silver substance began flowing out of my car, joining with the stream from the house, surrounding me in an ever-tightening circle. The cold intensified until each breath burned in my lungs. The pressure in my head built to an excruciating level. Then, like a spotlight being switched off, everything went dark. When I regained consciousness, I was lying in my front yard. Normal, ordinary grass pressed against my cheek. Above me, the night sky was filled with stars, and a small crescent moon hung innocuously among them. My watch showed it was just after 4 in the morning. Had I hallucinated the entire episode? Had I suffered some kind of breakdown and imagined the monstrous moon, the watching face, the living silver substance? As I staggered to my feet, relief washing over me, I noticed something that stopped my breath. Despite the normal appearance of the crescent moon above, the shadows in my yard were all wrong, stretching in impossible directions, as if cast by a light source directly overhead. A light source that wasn't visibly present. And on my forearm, just below the sleeve of my t-shirt, was a small, perfect circle of silvery residue that caught the starlight with an unnatural gleam. What remains after the impossible becomes your reality? 3 days have passed since that night. 3 days of normalcy that feels like a thin veneer over something profoundly disturbed. I haven't seen the face in the moon again. The nights have featured appropriate lunar phases, the expected waxing crescent slowly growing toward first quarter. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. I called my doctor and got a prescription for anxiety medication. I spoke with a therapist about stress-induced hallucinations. I researched sleep paralysis and night terrors. I've constructed a comfortable framework of rational explanations that should put my mind at ease. But the silvery mark on my arm remains. It doesn't wash off. It doesn't fade. Under normal light, it looks like an ordinary birthmark or scar, a perfect circle about the size of a quarter. But in darkness, it gleams with its own internal luminescence. Sometimes, I catch it pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat, growing brighter with each throb of my pulse. I've taken to wearing long sleeves despite the warm weather. I almost convinced myself that everything else was a product of an overtaxed mind until yesterday. I was at the grocery store, standing in the checkout line, when the elderly woman behind me gasped. When I turned to ask if she was all right, she was staring at me with an expression of unmistakable recognition and fear. "You've been marked by the Watcher," she whispered in heavily accented English. Before I could respond, she abandoned her shopping cart and hurried away, making some kind of protective gesture with her hands. Last night, I finally worked up the courage to look out my window at the moon. It was a normal first quarter moon, exactly as it should be. Yet as I watched, I could have sworn I saw the shadow of a finger move across its surface, like someone testing the transparency of a window from the other side. I'm writing this account now because I need a record of what happened, what is happening. The doctors and therapists listen sympathetically but don't believe me. My sister thinks I need a longer prescription and possibly inpatient care. No one believes that something from beyond our understanding has taken an interest in me specifically. No one except the old woman in the grocery store who recognized the mark for what it was. I've started seeing the silver substance again, just glimpses from the corner of my eye. A quicksilver ripple across my kitchen floor that disappears when I turn to look directly at it. A metallic gleam on my bathroom mirror that wasn't there a moment before. The sensation of cold fingers gently probing at the edges of my thoughts while I'm drifting off to sleep. The mark on my arm pulses more frequently now, glowing brighter each night. Sometimes I wake to find myself standing at the window, with no memory of having gotten out of bed, staring up at the night sky as if awaiting instructions. Last night, I dreamed I was floating in space, surrounded by stars and absolute silence. Before me loomed the true face of the moon, not the familiar cratered surface visible from Earth, but the other side, the dark side that always faces away from us. It was covered in structures, massive, geometric formations that couldn't possibly be natural. And among those structures moved shadows that bent and shifted in ways that human bodies cannot. I woke with the certainty that it hadn't been a dream at all, but a vision, a glimpse of what the entity wanted me to see. This morning, my phone rang. Unknown caller. When I answered, there was only that familiar static, but within it, I could now discern words. The door opens both ways. I'm leaving this house today. I've packed a bag and booked a flight back east to stay with my sister. Perhaps distance will weaken whatever connection has been established. Perhaps in the crowded city, surrounded by millions of people in constant artificial light, I can escape the attention of the Watcher. But even as I make these plans, I know a terrible truth: the mark goes with me. And as long as I bear it, I remain seen, observed, connected to whatever exists on the other side of that lunar face. As I write these final lines, the sun is setting. Soon the moon will rise, a slightly larger waxing crescent than yesterday. I won't be here to see it. I'll be on the road, driving toward the airport, fleeing this threshold place where reality wears thin. But I know what will happen when the moon rises tonight. It will seek me out, its light finding me wherever I've gone. And when I glance at my arm, the mark will pulse in recognition. Somewhere, behind the face we see from Earth, the watcher will smile, pleased with its new connection to our world. Because now I understand what it meant by conduit. The tear in the sky works both ways. What can look in can also reach through. And it has, through me, leaving its silver signature on my flesh and mind. I check my watch. Time to leave. My suitcase is packed, my ticket confirmed. As I pick up my phone, it chimes with a text message. Unknown sender. The message contains only 5 words. The moon follows you everywhere. I look down at my arm. The circular mark is pulsing rapidly now, casting its silver light across the room even in broad daylight. Within its circumference, something is taking shape, a miniature version of that familiar face, looking up at me from my own skin. And it's smiling. What happens when those who guide us through the darkness vanish without a trace? The first thing I noticed that night was the unusual stillness of Lake Superior. Not a single wave crashed against the rocky shoreline below my rented cabin. No wind rustled through the pine trees surrounding the property. Just silence, complete and unnatural. I'd come to the Upper Peninsula to escape my life in Detroit, a messy divorce, mounting debts, and the suffocating feeling that I was drowning in responsibilities. James Porter, lighthouse enthusiast and failed husband, seeking solace in the remote beauty of Michigan's northernmost shores. 3 weeks of solitude to finish my book on Great Lakes maritime history. That evening, I sat on my porch with a glass of whiskey, watching the familiar, rhythmic flash of the Whitefish Point light in the distance. The beam had been my consistent companion since arriving, 15 seconds of darkness followed by a 5-second burst of light that painted the horizon. A dependable presence in an uncertain world. Until it wasn't. At exactly 9:37, the beam disappeared. I checked my watch, expecting the light to return after its usual 15-second interval. 20 seconds passed. 30. A minute. Nothing. Power outage, I told myself, though something in my gut tightened. I grabbed my binoculars from inside and trained them on the distant lighthouse. The structure was completely dark, a black silhouette against the night sky. I scanned the horizon, looking for the Eagle Harbor light that should have been visible further west. Also dark. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. My phone showed no service, not unusual in this remote area. I switched on the cabin's radio, turning the dial to the Coast Guard emergency frequency. Static crackled through the speaker, then a voice, distorted and urgent. Repeat, all stations be advised. Multiple lighthouse outages reported across Lakes Superior, Michigan, and Huron. Coast Guard units dispatched to the transmission cut to static. I stepped outside again, breathing in the too still air. The lake's surface looked like black glass, reflecting a sky devoid of stars and moon. Had clouds rolled in? No, the sky was clear, yet somehow darker than it should have been. The surrounding forest seemed to lean inward, watching. A low vibration hummed through the floorboards beneath my feet. Not quite a sound, more a physical sensation, like standing too close to massive machinery. My whiskey glass trembled, tiny ripples forming on its surface. From somewhere in the distance came the drone of an engine, a Coast Guard helicopter, I presumed, heading toward Whitefish Point. Its searchlight swept across the water, a lonely beam cutting through oppressive darkness. I watched as it approached the lighthouse, hovering. The searchlight focused on the tower, moving methodically across the structure. Then, Without warning, the helicopter's light flickered and went out. The sound of its rotors faltered, stuttered, and stopped. For a split second, the aircraft hung motionless in the air. Then it dropped like a stone into the black waters below. No explosion. No crash. Just gone, swallowed by the lake without so much as a splash. I stood frozen, unable to process what I'd just witnessed. My rational mind scrambled for explanations, mechanical failure, some kind of atmospheric anomaly, my eyes playing tricks in the darkness. But deep down, I knew something was very, very wrong on the shores of Lake Superior. The humming beneath my feet intensified, and the water at the shoreline began to recede, drawing back as if the lake itself were inhaling a deep breath. And somehow, I knew it was looking at me. Morning broke with deceptive normalcy. Sunlight filtered through the pines, birds chirped, and Lake Superior lapped peacefully against the shore. If not for the persistent knot in my stomach, I might have convinced myself that last night was merely a nightmare brought on by isolation and too much whiskey. But the Whitefish Point light remained dark, even in daylight. I packed a backpack with essentials, water, food, flashlight, first aid kit, and headed toward my truck. I had to see for myself. Perhaps there would be rescue operations for the helicopter. Perhaps there would be answers. The radio in my truck picked up only static across all frequencies. The GPS showed my location but couldn't connect to satellites for routing. On the road to Whitefish Point, I passed no other vehicles. The small tourist shops and scattered houses along the way sat empty, doors ajar, as if their occupants had left in a hurry. A raven watched from a telephone pole as I drove past, its head cocking to follow my progress. Something about its gaze felt calculating, intelligent. When I looked in my rearview mirror, 3 more had joined it. The hair on my arm stood up as I rounded the final curve and the lighthouse came into view. It stood tall and white against the blue sky, appearing perfectly normal except for one detail: the lantern room at the top was empty. Not just unlit, but empty. The Fresnel lens, historic and irreplaceable, was gone. I parked in the empty lot and approached cautiously. The visitor center door swung open at my touch. Inside, coffee mugs sat half full on desks. Computer screens displayed Coast Guard monitoring systems, all showing the same message: signal lost, attempting reconnection against a red background. On one desk, I found a logbook with the final entry from the previous night. 2135, multiple reports of lighthouse failures across the Great Lakes system. Awaiting confirmation from Central Command. 2137, all lighthouses confirmed non-operational. Helicopter teams dispatched from Traverse City Station to assess critical locations. 2142, communication lost with Traverse City team. Attempting to re-establish contact. 2146, something's happening at the water. The lake is behaving strangely. Chief Wilkins is going to check. The rest of us are monitoring from ends. The entry ended midward, a pen line trailing off the page as if the writer had been pulled away suddenly. I felt eyes on me and spun around. Nothing but empty space. Yet the sensation persisted. I was being watched, studied, measured. Hello? My voice echoed through the vacant building. Coast Guard? Anyone here? The only response was the gentle hum of electronics and a distant, rhythmic sound coming from outside. Thump, 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 like a heartbeat. I followed the sound to the back of the building, where a door led to the lighthouse keeper's quarters and the tower itself. With each step, the thumping grew louder, more insistent. Thump, thump, thump. The door to the tower was ajar. Beyond it, a spiral staircase wound upward. The thumping seemed to come from above. "Don't go up there," a voice in my head warned. "Turn around. Drive away. Forget what you saw." But I couldn't. I needed to know. The metal steps clanged under my feet as I ascended. 78 steps to the top. I counted each one, focusing on numbers to keep panic at bay. Thump, thump, thump. At step 43, I noticed the walls were wet. Not with water, but with something darker, thicker. It glistened in the emergency lighting, pulsing slightly with each thump from above. At step 67, I realized the substance was moving upward, flowing against gravity toward the lantern room. At step 75, I smelled it, like copper and salt and something ancient and wrong. At step 78, I reached the lantern room and understood why the Fresnel lens was missing. It hadn't been stolen or removed. It had been replaced. Where the historic lens should have been, something organic pulsed and throbbed. A massive, crystalline structure that resembled a lens in shape only, composed of a material that seemed neither solid nor liquid. It was translucent, with swirling patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. And at its center, suspended in the gelatinous mass, were uniforms, Coast Guard uniforms, still containing the shapes of the people who had worn them. The mass pulsed again. Thump. And as it did, it emitted not light, but darkness, a visible beam of absolute blackness that shot across the lake toward the horizon. My phone buzzed in my pocket, impossible, given the lack of service. The screen showed no caller ID, just a string of coordinates. Then a voice came through, distorted and bubbling, as if speaking through water. "We see you, James Porter. We've been watching for so long. Come join us. The water is waiting." I dropped the phone and ran, taking the stairs 3 at a time, nearly falling in my haste to escape. Behind me, the thumping accelerated, keeping pace with my racing heart. Thump, 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 thump. Outside, I sprinted for my truck, fumbling with the keys as I glanced back at the lighthouse. From the lantern room, tendrils of that dark, viscous substance now stretched out like fingers reaching for the sky. And they were growing longer, spreading outward. I gunned the engine and sped away, gravel spraying from beneath my tires. In the rearview mirror, I saw those dark tendrils pause, then change direction. They were pointing at me. I drove without direction, putting distance between myself and Whitefish Point. My hands shook on the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. The rational part of my brain tried desperately to make sense of what I had seen, some kind of biological growth, perhaps. A hallucination triggered by stress? A military experiment gone wrong? But I knew better. What pulsed in that lighthouse wasn't from our world. It didn't obey our rules. The truck's radio suddenly crackled to life, startling me so badly I swerved onto the shoulder. Through bursts of static, fragments of emergency broadcasts cut in and out. Stay away from all bodies of water. Multiple disappearances reported at marinas and beach communities, phenomenon spreading to inland lakes, military attempting to establish perimeter around. Then, nothing but white noise. I switched it off. The sky had darkened despite it being mid-afternoon. Heavy clouds rolled in from the lake, unnatural in their movement, too coordinated, too purposeful. I needed shelter, somewhere away from water, somewhere to think. I turned onto a logging road that wound into the dense forest, away from the shoreline. After several miles of increasingly rough terrain, I came upon an abandoned fire lookout tower perched atop a small hill. Perfect, high ground, good visibility, and most importantly, far from any lake or stream. The wooden steps creaked as I climbed to the observation deck. From this vantage point, I could see for miles in all directions. To the north, Lake Superior stretched toward the horizon, its waters unnaturally still except for movement. Not waves, but something else. Massive shapes shifting beneath the surface, distorting the water above them like dark islands rising and submerging. To the east, where smaller inland lakes dotted the landscape, thin columns of darkness rose into the sky, the same black beams I'd seen emanating from the Whitefish Point light. Each beam connected a body of water to the clouds above. My phone buzzed again. The same string of coordinates. I pulled up my offline maps and plotted the location, the center of Lake Superior, the deepest part. Why there? What was trying to draw me to that spot? As the sun dipped toward the horizon, hidden behind the unnatural cloud cover, I set up camp in the lookout tower. I had enough supplies for maybe 2 days. After that, I had no plan. Civilization seemed to have vanished around me, communications were failing, and something ancient and malevolent had awakened in the waters. Night fell completely, and with it came an unnerving sight. Across the darkened landscape, points of light appeared, not the warm yellow of human habitation, but a cold, blue-green phosphorescence that pulsed in perfect unison. They followed the shorelines, clustered around inland lakes, traced the paths of rivers and streams. They were moving. Toward what? I couldn't tell, but they moved with purpose. A sharp crack from below startled me. Someone, or something, was climbing the tower steps. I doused my lantern and crouched in the corner, clutching my pocket knife, a pathetic defense against whatever might be coming, but it was all I had. The footsteps were uneven, dragging. Thump scrape. Thump scrape. Labored breathing accompanied the sound, wet and bubbling. A figure emerged from the stairwell. In the darkness, I could make out the shape of a Coast Guard uniform, dripping wet. The face above it was wrong. Distended, features sliding across flesh that seemed too malleable, too fluid. Where eyes should have been, 2 points of that same blue-green light pulsed in unison with the distant lights across the landscape. James Porter, it said, the voice gurgling as if spoken through liquid. Why do you run from us? The water wants to embrace you. I pressed myself harder against the wall. Who are you? What do you want? The thing wearing a Coast Guard officer's shape tilted its head at an impossible angle. We are the ones who came before. Before your lights. Before your ships. Before you. It took another lurching step forward. We slept in the deep places while you scattered your artificial stars across our domain, disrupting our dreams with your beacons. The lighthouses, I whispered. Yes. The word elongated, sibilant. Your lighthouses. Your arrogance. Thinking you could make the waters safe. The waters were never meant to be safe, James Porter. They were meant to take. To claim. To consume. It stretched out a hand. The fingers were too long, the joints too numerous. Come with me. They're waiting. Everyone is waiting. Down in the deep parts, where the pressure makes diamonds of bones and pearls of eyes. I lunged for the stairwell, shoving past the creature. Its skin felt cold and yielding, like pushing through dense seaweed. It made no move to stop me, only laughed, a sound like water rushing down a drain. I took the stairs 3 at a time, nearly falling in my haste. Behind me, the thing called out, "Run if you must, James Porter." The water finds all paths eventually. It always returns to the deep. I reached my truck and fumbled with the keys, glancing back at the tower. The creature stood on the observation deck now, its form silhouetted against the night sky. It raised its arms, and in response, all the blue-green lights across the landscape pulsed brighter. The truck engine roared to life, and I sped down the logging road, branches whipping against the windshield. I had no destination in mind, only the desperate need to put distance between myself and that thing. The road curved, and suddenly water glistened ahead, a stream crossing the path, too wide to jump with the vehicle. I slammed on the brakes. As the headlights illuminated the water's surface, I saw it wasn't flowing normally. Against all laws of nature, it was flowing uphill toward Lake Superior. And within its current, those same blue-green lights pulsed and swirled. I threw the truck into reverse, but it was too late. The water surged forward, no longer contained by the streambed, rising up like a living wall. It crashed over the hood of my truck, not with the force of normal water, but with deliberate malice, seeking entry through every crack and crevice. The last thing I remembered before darkness took me was the water finding its way through the air vents, forming a tendril that reached for my face with terrible intelligence in its movement. And within that tendril, suspended like insects in amber, were dozens of tiny human forms, their faces pressed against their liquid prison, mouths open in silent screams. I awoke gasping, my lungs burning as if I'd been underwater. But I was dry, lying on hard ground. Above me, a ceiling of rough stone. Around me, walls of the same material, a cave, dimly lit by that same phosphorescent blue-green glow that seemed to emanate from the very rock itself. How had I gotten here? The last memory I had was of water invading my truck, reaching for me with unnatural purpose. I should be dead, drowned, claimed by whatever force had taken the Coast Guard and who knows how many others. I sat up slowly, my head pounding. My clothes were dry but stiff with salt. The air tasted of brine and something else, something ancient and alien. The cave extended in two directions. From one passage came the rhythmic sound of water lapping against stone. From the other, voices, distant, indistinct, but unmistakably human. I chose the voices, moving cautiously through the narrowing passage. The blue-green light grew stronger as I proceeded, illuminating bizarre formations along the walls. Not stalactites and stalagmites, but structures that resembled organs, lungs, hearts, brains, rendered in stone and crystal and something that glistened wetly. The passage opened into a larger chamber. And there I found them, dozens of people, perhaps hundreds, standing motionless. Coast Guard personnel still in uniform. Tourists in summer clothing. Lighthouse keepers in their characteristic attire. Fishermen. Children. All standing, all breathing, all staring upward at the chamber ceiling with the same blank expression. And all with eyes that glowed with that same blue-green light. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice echoing off the stone walls. None of them responded or even seemed to notice my presence. I approached the nearest figure, a woman in Coast Guard uniform, the name Martinez visible on her badge. Her skin had a translucent quality, veins clearly visible beneath the surface, pulsing with blue-green luminescence instead of blood. "Officer Martinez?" I reached out hesitantly to touch her arm. The moment my fingertips made contact, her head snapped toward me with mechanical precision. Her mouth opened, but the voice that emerged wasn't human. It was the same gurgling, liquid voice I'd heard at the fire tower. "James Porter, you've come at last. Not by choice, but you've come. I stumbled backward. All around the chamber, heads turned in unison to face me, hundreds of glowing eyes fixing me with the same empty stare. What have you done to these people? I demanded, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. Martinez's body took a step toward me, movements jerky and uncoordinated, as if whoever, whatever, was controlling or wasn't fully accustomed to human locomotion. They are becoming. As all things eventually return to the water, so too do they return to us. Their lights extinguished. Their individual flames subsumed into our greater radiance. Who are you? I backed away as all the figures began to move toward me with the same awkward gait. We are the depths. The first ones. Those who ruled these waters before the ice came and drove us down into the deepest trenches where pressure and darkness became our home. Martinez's mouth moved, but now other mouths joined in, creating a horrifying chorus of the same voice from different throats. We slept while your kind spread across the land. We dreamed as you built your cities. We waited as you placed your false stars along our shores, trying to tame what should never be tamed. My back hit the wall. There was nowhere left to retreat. The time of sleep is over, James Porter. The waters rise. The lights go out. The deep places will claim what was always rightfully ours. They surrounded me now, a closing circle of possessed humanity. I pressed harder against the wall, feeling the rough stone dig into my back. But instead of solid resistance, the wall gave way slightly, yielding like damp clay. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the stone was changing, reforming, creating an opening where none had been before. An escape? Or another trap? I had no choice. As the circle of glowing-eyed people closed in, their movements becoming more fluid, more coordinated with each passing second, I dove through the opening in the wall. The stone sealed behind me immediately, cutting off the blue-green light and plunging me into total darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, praying it still worked after whatever had brought me here. A weak beam illuminated a narrow tunnel sloping steeply downward. The walls were slick with moisture, pulsing subtly as if alive. I had no choice but to follow it down. The tunnel descended for what seemed like miles, spiraling ever deeper. The air grew colder, damper, heavier with each step. My flashlight beam weakened, the batteries failing against whatever force permeated this place. Finally, the tunnel opened into an immense cavern, so vast my failing light couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling. But I didn't need it to. The entire chamber was illuminated by what lay at its center. A lake, perfectly circular, its surface mirror smooth and black as obsidian. And rising from its center, a column of water that defied gravity, stretching upward until it vanished into darkness. Within that column, shapes moved, massive, sinuous forms that made no biological sense to my human mind. And surrounding the lake, more people, thousands of them, standing in concentric circles. All different, from different times, different eras. Some in modern clothes, others in garments decades or centuries old, their forms increasingly translucent and ethereal the farther back they stood. All the missing. Not just from yesterday or last week, but from throughout history. Everyone the lakes had ever claimed, preserved somehow in this underground cathedral. At the edge of the black lake stood a solitary figure I recognized immediately, the lighthouse keeper from Whitefish Point, still in his uniform. Unlike the others, his eyes were normal, human. He turned to me, his face haggard. "You shouldn't have come down here, son. What is this place?" I asked, my voice small in the vastness. "The heart of it all. the truth beneath the Great Lakes. He gestured to the suspended column of water. They've been here all along, sleeping in the deep parts. Our lighthouses, our shipping lanes, our noise, we've been disturbing their slumber for over 2 centuries. And now they're awake. The Coast Guard. Gone. Taken. Becoming part of it. He looked at me with tired eyes. Like I soon will be. Like you will be. There has to be a way to stop this, I insisted. The keeper laughed bitterly. With what? Bombs? Guns? You might as well try to fight the tide with a bucket. This isn't a war we can win. It's a transformation we can only surrender to. From the Black Lake, a sound emerged, not heard with ears, but felt in bone and blood and the spaces between thoughts. A call. A summons. All around the chamber, the concentric circles of figures took one synchronized step toward the lake. The keeper's eyes suddenly flared with that telltale blue-green light. They're calling us home, James. Can't you hear how beautiful it is? He took a step toward the lake. Then another. I grabbed his arm. Don't. He turned to me, tears of luminescent blue-green trailing down his cheeks. I'm so tired of fighting it. Aren't you? Don't you want to rest? To become part of something greater than yourself? The call intensified, reverberating through my skull. And to my horror, I did feel it, a longing, a pull toward that impossible column of water. A desire to surrender, to let go, to dissolve into something vaster than my small human existence. My feet moved of their own accord, taking a step toward the lake. The keeper smiled sadly. That's it. Let go. The water always wins in the end. Another step. The black surface was now just feet away, reflecting nothing, absorbing all light. A third step. My toes touched the edge of the impossible lake. And something within me, some core of stubborn humanity, rebelled. No. I stumbled backward, fighting against the pull. I won't become part of this. The keeper's expression hardened, his eyes now fully transformed, pulsing with alien light. Then you will die as yourself, alone and afraid. Is that truly preferable? From the column of water, a massive shape pressed against the surface, a suggestion of something with too many eyes, too many limbs, features that shifted between forms that had no names in human language. It saw me. It knew me. And it was coming for me. I ran. Away from the Black Lake, away from the keeper with his glowing eyes, away from the thousands of captured souls arranged in their concentric circles. I ran blindly, no destination in mind except away. Behind me, the call intensified, no longer a summons but a command, hammering against my consciousness. The walls of the cavern trembled, stones breaking free and crashing to the ground. The entire underground complex was becoming unstable. I found another tunnel and plunged into it, using my failing flashlight to navigate. This passage wound upward, giving me hope of reaching the surface. But with each turn, with each fork in the path, I felt less certain. The tunnels formed a labyrinth, and I was hopelessly lost. The batteries in my flashlight finally died, plunging me into absolute darkness. I pressed on, feeling my way along damp stone walls, guided only by the slight upward incline of the floor. Time lost all meaning. I might have been wandering for hours or days. Hunger and thirst became distant concerns compared to the overwhelming need to escape, to reach the surface, to see the sky once more. When I finally saw light ahead, natural light, gray and diffuse, I nearly wept with relief. The tunnel ended at a small opening, barely large enough to crawl through. Beyond it, I could see trees, sky, the normal world. I squeezed through the opening and emerged onto a rocky shoreline. Lake Superior stretched before me, still unnaturally calm. The sky above was heavy with storm clouds, and the air felt charged with electricity. I had no idea where I was, somewhere along the southern shore of the lake, but miles from where I'd started. No buildings were visible, no roads, no signs of human presence. My phone was gone, lost somewhere in my underground journey. I was alone, without resources, on the shore of a lake that now harbored something ancient and malevolent. I turned to head inland, away from the water, when I noticed something peculiar further down the shoreline, a structure that hadn't been there moments before. A lighthouse, stark white against the dark landscape, its beacon sweeping across the troubled sky. That was impossible. I knew every lighthouse on Lake Superior. I documented them all for my book. There shouldn't be one here, in this uninhabited stretch of shoreline. And yet there it stood, beckoning. Every instinct told me to run in the opposite direction, to get as far from the water as possible. But something about that light pulled at me, not the unnatural compulsion of the deep, but something else. Something almost human. I made my way toward it, picking a path along the rocky shore. As I drew closer, details became clearer. It wasn't an old lighthouse, like Whitefish Point or Eagle Harbor. This was something new, its architecture unlike any Great Lakes lighthouse I'd studied. The door at its base stood open. From within came warm, yellow light, not the cold blue-green phosphorescence of the deep. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse. No answer came, but the light from within pulsed once, as if in acknowledgement. I hesitated at the threshold, then stepped inside. The interior was simple, a circular room with a spiral staircase leading upward. On the walls hung photographs of lighthouses, every one of the Great Lakes beacons that had gone dark. Whitefish Point, Eagle Harbor, Grand Haven, Old Mackinac, dozens more. And beside each photograph, a name, dates, lives spanned and ended. The keepers. All the keepers who had maintained these lights, going back centuries. Those who had dedicated their lives to warning ships away from dangerous shores. Among them, I found the Whitefish Point keeper's photo, the same man I'd seen at the edge of the Black Lake. Below his picture, a simple inscription, "He keeps his light burning still." The staircase called to me. I climbed, each step bringing me closer to the source of the warm light above. 78 steps, just like Whitefish Point. I counted each one. At the top, I found not the crystalline horror I'd witnessed before, but a proper lantern room. At its center burned a flame, not electric, but actual fire, dancing within a complex arrangement of lenses and mirrors that magnified and projected its light across the lake. An old-fashioned lighthouse, the kind that hadn't operated in over a century. Beside the flame stood a figure, translucent, wavering, like a reflection in disturbed water. An elderly woman in the uniform of a lighthouse keeper from another era. Her eyes held no blue-green glow, only a determined humanity. "You made it," she said, her voice distant yet clear. "We weren't sure you would." "Who are you?" I asked. "Elizabeth Delaney, keeper of the Big Bay Point Light, 1908 to 1912. Her form shimmered. "Or what's left of me. What's left of all of us. All of." She gestured, and suddenly the lantern room was crowded with translucent figures, men and women in the garb of different periods, all with the same determined expression. "The keepers," I whispered. Elizabeth nodded. "Those of us who resisted, who remembered our purpose even after the waters took us. We surf still, though our lights went dark long ago. The thing in the lake has always been there," another ghost interrupted, a bearded man in 19th century clothing, sleeping beneath the waters since before humans walked these shores. "Our ships, our commerce, our noise, we've been disturbing it for generations. And now it wakes fully." "It's taken the Coast Guard," I said. "It's taken everyone." "Not everyone," Elizabeth corrected. "Not you. And not those who might still be warned." I looked out through the glass walls of the lantern room. In the distance, I could see lights along the shore, towns, cities, millions of people unaware of what was awakening in the depths. "What can I do?" I asked. "I'm just one person." "You're a keeper now," Elizabeth said simply. She gestured to the flame. "This is the last light. The only one they haven't corrupted yet. Fueled by what remains of our collective will, our remembered purpose." The bearded man stepped forward. "It cannot last much longer. Already, the deep ones sense it, move against it." As if to confirm his words, the waters of Lake Superior began to churn. The unnatural calm was breaking. Dark shapes moved beneath the surface, massive forms converging on the shoreline where our impossible lighthouse stood. "What do you need me to do?" I asked, a strange calm settling over me. Elizabeth placed her insubstantial hand over the flame. "Take it. Carry it inland, away from the water. Warn them. Light the way to safety." I reached toward the flame, expecting heat, pain. Instead, as my fingers touched the fire, it flowed into me, not burning, but filling me with purpose, with clarity. My skin began to glow from within, not with the blue-green light of the depths, but with the warm yellow radiance of a true beacon. "They'll come for you," the bearded keeper warned. "The waters will rise. The Taken will hunt you. You'll never be safe near any shore again." "But others might be, if they heed your warning," Elizabeth added. "If they move to higher ground, away from the waters." Through the windows, I could see the lake rising now, forming impossible waves that moved with deliberate malice toward our position. The black water seethed with blue-green light, pulsing in rage. The lighthouse trembled beneath my feet, stones cracking as the furious lake assaulted its foundation. "Go," Elizabeth commanded, "while there's still time." I raced down the spiral staircase as the structure began to collapse around me. Above, the ghosts of the keepers joined hands around the now empty lamp, their forms glowing brighter as they poured the last of their collective will into one final stand against the rising waters. I burst through the door just as the lighthouse began to topple. Behind me, a great crash as the tower collapsed. Before me, a path leading inland, away from the shore. I ran, my body glowing with borrowed light, each footstep leaving a brief illumination on the ground that quickly faded. The water surged behind me, a roaring wall of fury that consumed the fallen lighthouse and reached for me with liquid tendrils. But it couldn't touch me, not while I carried the light. Not while I maintained my purpose. I ran through the night, the glow within me never dimming. And as I ran, I called out a warning to anyone who might hear, to any isolated cabin or rural home in my path. Stay away from the water. Get to high ground. The lights have gone out. Some listened. Some didn't. Those who heeded my warning gathered what they could and followed the trail of light I left behind me. those who dismissed me as a madman. I couldn't force them. I could only hope they would realize the danger before the waters came for them. We moved inland, our group growing as we went. Away from the Great Lakes, away from rivers and streams, away from any body of water large enough to serve as a gateway from the depths. Days passed. Weeks. News spread slowly in a world where communications were failing, where power grids were collapsing as water treatment plants and hydroelectric dams became corrupted by the same malevolence that had claimed the lighthouses. But spread it did, the warning, the exodus away from shorelines. Not everyone believed. Cities along the Great Lakes remained largely populated, their residents unable or unwilling to abandon their homes despite the increasing reports of disappearances of strange blue-green lights seen beneath the waves of water that sometimes flowed against gravity. I found myself the reluctant leader of a growing community of refugees, all gathered on high ground in what had once been a state forest in central Michigan. The light within me had dimmed somewhat, no longer visible in daylight, but still glowing softly in darkness, a reminder of my purpose, my promise to the keepers. We established lookouts, watching for any sign of advancing water or the telltale blue-green glow of the possessed. We sent scouts to other communities, spreading the warning further. We prepared as best we could for a future where the waters, all waters, were no longer safe. And still, I dreamed of that black lake far below the surface, of the keeper with his glowing eyes, of the thousands of souls arranged in concentric circles around that impossible column of water. In my dreams, they call to me still. They promise rest, peace, an end to responsibility. Sometimes, I almost listen. But then I remember Elizabeth Delaney and the other keepers who resisted even after death, who remembered their purpose, to warn, to guide, to save those who can be saved. And so I maintain my watch, here on our island of dry land in a world increasingly dominated by hostile waters. I keep the last light burning within me, a beacon for those still seeking safety. I don't know how this ends. Perhaps the waters will eventually reclaim everything, as they did in ancient times before humanity rose to briefly challenge their dominance. Perhaps we will find a way to drive the ancient presence back into its slumber deep beneath the lake beds. All I know is that while I live, while this light burns within me, I'll continue to warn those who will listen. It's what keepers do. So if you're reading this, if my journal has somehow found its way to you, heed my warning, stay away from the water. All water. It's not just a conduit for something else anymore, it is something else. Something ancient. Something patient. Something that has been waiting to reclaim what it believes was always rightfully its own. The lighthouses of Michigan, of all the Great Lakes, went dark for a reason. They were the first to fall because they represented our defiance, our refusal to yield to the water's natural danger. Now the true nature of the lakes has awakened, and there are no more artificial stars to guide us safely through the darkness. There is only this last light. This final warning. Stay away from the water. It's coming for us all. From the Journal of James Porter, found 3 months after the Great Evacuation. The document you've just read was recovered from an abandoned settlement in what was once central Michigan. The pages were found clutched in the hand of a deceased male, approximately 40 years of age, whose body exhibited an unusual phenomenon. Even in death, his skin emitted a faint yellow glow. No other survivors were located at the site, though evidence suggests a community of at least 200 people had lived there until recently. Multiple structures had been erected, crops had been planted, defenses had been established. But no bodies were found other than the journal's author. A particular note were the lookout towers positioned along the perimeter, all facing the same direction, not toward Lake Michigan or Lake Huron, but toward the center of the former state. Toward what satellite imagery now shows as an impossible geographical feature, a body of water where no lake existed before, perfectly circular, expanding slowly but steadily in all directions. Its waters are black as obsidian, and at night, blue-green lights can be seen moving beneath its surface. We continue to monitor the situation from our facility here in the Rocky Mountains, well away from any major water source, as per protocol deluge. Air reconnaissance has been deemed too risky following the loss of Aerial Team Bravo when their helicopter inexplicably malfunctioned while flying over the circular lake last month. The perimeter around the Great Lakes has been established as ordered, but we have already lost contact with 3 outposts. Survivors report the same phenomenon, water flowing uphill, blue-green lights, personnel walking willingly into rising waters despite direct orders to maintain position. This document is being added to the archive as a potential first-hand account of initial manifestation. Whether its contents are the ravings of a man driven to madness by isolation and fear, or a true account of what we now face, is for others to determine. For now, we maintain our vigil from the high ground, and we keep our own lights burning against the growing darkness. Colonel Eleanor Hayes, Continental Defense Initiative, High Ground Protocol Document Classification, Abyssal Black Authorized Distribution, none. Have you ever wondered what would happen if all sound simply vanished? The Miami sun blazed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Oceanic Dynamics, casting long rectangles of light across the polished concrete floors of our open-plan office. I'd been with the company for just under 3 months, still learning names and navigating the complex social hierarchy that existed beneath the startup's casual veneer. My desk faced east, giving me a spectacular view of Biscayne Bay that I'd begun to take for granted. Behind me sat 28 other employees, their keyboards clicking and phones occasionally ringing, the ambient soundtrack of modern work life. My colleague Miguel occupied the desk directly behind mine. I could always tell when he was frustrated by the distinctive way he'd exhale through his teeth. That Tuesday started like any other, the hum of the air conditioning, Madison's squeaky chair as she shifted her weight, the muted conversations about weekend plans and project deadlines. Nothing indicated it would be the day our reality fractured. I was in the middle of a conference call with a client when I first noticed something odd. The voice on the other end of the line seemed to fade in and out, like a radio station losing signal. I tapped my earbuds, assuming the Bluetooth connection was failing. "Could you repeat that last part?" I asked, pressing my finger against the earbud to seat it more firmly. No response. Just silence. I looked at my screen. The call was still connected, timer still running. I spoke louder. "Hello? Are you still there?" Nothing. I removed my earbuds and swiveled my chair toward Miguel. "Hey, my call just cut out. Is the internet down?" His lips moved, but no sound came out. A chill ran down my spine despite the Miami heat. I watched his mouth form words, saw the confused expression spread across his face as he realized I couldn't hear him. I stood up abruptly, my chair rolling back and hitting the desk behind me. No scraping sound. No thud. Nothing. Around the office, others were beginning to notice. Madison was repeatedly tapping her pen against her desk. I could see the movement but heard no corresponding tap. Raj was snapping his fingers next to his ear. Taylor had dropped her coffee mug, but the crash I braced for never came. Complete silence had descended upon us. My heart raced as I watched panic bloom across the office. People mouthed words frantically, some clutching their throats as if they could physically force sound to emerge. Others rushed to the windows or the hallway door, presumably checking if the phenomenon extended beyond our office. I felt the vibration of footsteps as people moved around, but heard nothing. No shuffling of feet, no breathing, not even the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. The silence was absolute, a vacuum of auditory sensation that felt physically oppressive, as if the air itself had thickened. I tried to calm myself. There has to be a rational explanation. Gas leak? Some kind of localized EMP that affected our hearing? A shared hallucination from something in the ventilation system? But the primitive part of my brain screamed that this was wrong, fundamentally wrong in a way that defied logical explanation. As I looked around the room, I noticed our office manager, Eliza, standing completely still by the water cooler. Unlike everyone else's expressions of confusion and fear, her face showed something different, recognition, perhaps even resignation, as if she'd been expecting this. Our eyes met briefly before she quickly looked away, busying herself with filling a paper cup with water no one could hear pouring. 20 minutes passed in this maddening silence. Communication devolved to frantic gestures and hastily typed messages on computer screens and phones. Someone wrote "What is happening?" in bold letters on the whiteboard in the conference room. No one had an answer. Then I felt it, a change in pressure, subtle at first, then building. My ears popped painfully, and sound rushed back into the world with disorienting intensity. The air conditioning hummed. Phones rang. Someone was sobbing in the corner. The cacophony after such profound silence was almost more disturbing than the quiet had been. "Is everyone okay?" Miguel asked, his voice sounding unnaturally loud to my readjusting ears. People called out in affirmation, voices shaky and uncertain. I did a quick visual sweep of the office. Everyone seemed to be present, shaken but physically unharmed. Then Madison screamed, pointing at Devon's empty desk by the window. "Where's Devon?" she demanded, her voice cracking. He was just here. He was right there. Sure enough, Devon's chair was empty, pushed back from his desk as if he'd stood up in a hurry. His laptop was still open, screen showing an unfinished email. His navy blue jacket hung on the back of his chair. His half-finished coffee steamed beside his keyboard. But Devon was gone. Maybe he went to the bathroom, someone suggested hopefully. But we all knew, somehow, that wasn't the case. Devon had vanished during those 20 minutes of impossible silence. And as I looked across the now noisy office, I caught Eliza watching us all with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, something between sorrow and calculation. When our eyes met again, she didn't look away this time. Instead, she gave me a small, knowing nod that sent ice water through my veins. This wasn't over. The silence had taken Devon, and I was suddenly certain it would return for the rest of us, one by one. The rest of that Tuesday passed in a blur of police statements and nervous glances. Officers searched the building but found no trace of Devon. No security footage showed him leaving. His car remained in the parking garage. His phone went straight to voicemail. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist during those 20 minutes of silence. By Wednesday morning, management had brought in crisis counselors and installed new security cameras. They attributed the temporary hearing loss to some unexplained acoustical phenomenon and Devon's disappearance to, well, they didn't really explain that part. Just vague reassurances that they were exploring all possibilities. Few people believed them. Even fewer showed up for work. I arrived early, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The office felt different, the same furniture, Same bay views, same potted plants dying slowly in the corners, but altered in some fundamental way I couldn't articulate. Like returning to your childhood home to find the walls painted a slightly different shade. "You came back," said a voice behind me. I turned to find Eliza leaning against the doorframe, a steaming mug in her hands. In the 3 months I'd worked there, we'd rarely spoken beyond pleasantries. She was efficient but distant, her personal life a mystery to her colleagues. "I had to," I replied, not fully understanding my own answer. She nodded as if I confirmed something for her. "You felt it too, then?" The wrongness. The hair on my arm stood up. "What do you mean?" Eliza walked to the window, looking out at the bay where early morning sailors were setting out, unaware of the pocket of strangeness above them on the 23rd floor. "This building has always been sensitive," she said carefully. "I've been here 7 years. You're not the first group to experience something unusual." My mouth went dry. "What happened to Devon?" She turned to face me, her expression grave. "I don't know exactly. But I've seen enough to know that when sound returns, the office takes inventory. And sometimes it finds someone surplus." "That's insane," I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew on some level that she was telling the truth. More colleagues trickled in throughout the morning, each looking as sleep-deprived as I felt. Miguel nodded at me but kept his distance, as if proximity to me might somehow make him the next to vanish. Madison didn't come in at all. I tried to work, but found myself constantly scanning the office, cataloging who was present, noting their positions, creating a mental map I could reference if, when the silence returned. My gaze kept returning to Devon's empty desk, still untouched from yesterday. Someone had placed a small photo of him beside his monitor, Devon smiling on a fishing boat, holding up a respectable catch. The image felt like a memorial. Around 11, I noticed something strange. The usual office sounds were still present, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the elevator dinging in the hallway, but they seemed subtly wrong. The pitch was off, sometimes a note too high, sometimes too low. Conversations carried a strange echo, as if the words were being spoken twice, the second iteration just milliseconds behind the first. I looked around to see if anyone else noticed. A few people were tilting their heads questioningly or tapping their ears, but most continued working, oblivious. A headache began to form behind my eyes. The fluorescent lights seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. The temperature in the room fluctuated. One moment I was sweating, the next shivering. "It's happening again," I thought, panic rising. I walked to Eliza's desk near the entrance. "Something's wrong with the sound," I whispered. She looked up sharply. "You can hear it too?" "The doubling?" I nodded, relieved I wasn't imagining it. "It started like this last time," she said quietly. 3 years ago. Before your time. We lost someone then too." My blood ran cold. "Who?" "An intern. Nice kid from the University of Miami. One minute he was refilling the coffee machine, the next." She made a vanishing gesture with her fingers. "What do we do?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know if we can do anything," she replied. "But stay close to others. I've noticed it never takes more than one at a time." I returned to my desk, the doubled sounds growing more pronounced by the minute. My computer monitor showed tiny ripples across the screen, as if the pixels themselves were disturbed by whatever was happening. Miguel tapped me on the shoulder, making me jump. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice simultaneously reaching my ears and coming to me as if through a tunnel. Before I could answer, a high-pitched whine filled the office, first barely perceptible, then growing in intensity until several people clapped their hands over their ears. The sound was like metal grinding against metal, like the feedback from a microphone amplified 1,000 times. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, all sound ceased. The silence returned, absolute and smothering. I looked around frantically. Everyone was frozen, eyes wide with recognition and fear. We'd been here before. We knew what this meant. In the silence, I noticed details I'd missed during the first occurrence, how the air seemed to thicken, becoming almost gelatinous. How light refracted differently, creating subtle halos around every illuminated object. How time itself seemed to slow, stretching moments into agonizing eternities. I pulled out my phone and typed a message, showing it to Miguel. "Stay together." He nodded, grabbing a notebook and writing in large block letters, "Who will it take?" I looked around the office, counting heads. 12 people had come in today. All were accounted for, all visibly terrified but present. Then I noticed something disturbing. The small photo of Devin on his desk, it was changing. As I watched, his features began to blur, becoming indistinct, as if someone was gradually erasing him from existence. Not just his physical presence in the office, but every trace he'd left behind. I grabbed Miguel's arm and pointed. His face drained of color as he saw it too. The erasure continued. Devin's coffee mug, the one that had been steaming yesterday, began to fade, becoming translucent, then vanishing completely. His jacket disappeared next, followed by his backpack tucked under the desk. Within minutes, it was as if Devin had never occupied that space at all. The desk was bare, the chair pushed in neatly. And still the silence persisted. I felt a tap on my shoulder and nearly screamed, though no sound would have emerged. Eliza stood behind me, her face ashen. She held up her phone with a message. "It's cleaning up the evidence." Cold dread settled in my stomach. This wasn't just about Devin disappearing, something was methodically removing all proof he had ever existed. I scanned the office again, trying to determine if anyone else had vanished during this second silence. Everyone seemed accounted for, but then I noticed Taylor behaving strangely by the conference room. She was pointing at nothing, her mouth open in a silent scream. Others turned to look but appeared confused, seeing nothing where she was pointing. I moved closer and realized with horror what was happening. Where Taylor pointed, the air was wrong. Distorted, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt, but more pronounced. Within this distortion, I caught glimpses of movement, something shifting and reforming, something with shape but no substance. And it was reaching for her. Taylor backed away, colliding with a desk, her eyes never leaving the distortion. I tried to move toward her, but found my feet impossibly heavy, as if the air had become molasses. The others saw my struggle and looked down at their own feet in dawning comprehension. We were all immobilized, forced to watch as the distortion enveloped Taylor. Her expression changed from terror to confusion, then to an unnatural calm. She stopped struggling. Her eyes, previously wide with fear, became distant, unfocused. She looked peaceful. And then, with a violent return of sound that made my ears ring, the silence broke. The office erupted in noise, people gasping, crying out, the printer suddenly whirring to life as if nothing had happened. I stumbled forward, finally able to move again, rushing to where Taylor had been standing. But Taylor was gone. And when I turned back to look at the others, I realized with mounting horror that no one was looking for her. No one was calling her name or asking where she'd gone. "Where's Taylor?" I demanded, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Miguel looked at me blankly. "Who's Taylor?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "Taylor Chen, marketing coordinator. Desk by the conference room. She was just here." Blank stares all around. Even Eliza looked confused. "There's no Taylor in this office," said Raj gently, as if explaining something to a child. "Maybe you're thinking of someone from your last job?" I looked at Taylor's desk, or where her desk should have been. Like Devon's, it was now completely bare, as if it had been unoccupied for weeks. No family photos, no coffee mug with the NASA logo, no peacock feathers she kept in a slender vase. No trace of Taylor remained. And no one remembered her but me. I didn't sleep Wednesday night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Taylor's face as that distortion enveloped her, the transition from terror to that unnatural serenity just before she vanished. And the complete absence of recognition when I mentioned her name afterward. Devon had been erased from the physical world but remained in memory. Taylor had been erased from both. I spent hours scouring social media for any trace of Taylor Chen. Nothing. I called HR at home, making up a story about needing contact information for a project handoff. The HR director had no record of anyone by that name ever working at Oceanic Dynamics. By Thursday morning, I was running on caffeine and fear. Against all reason, I returned to the office. Only 7 others did the same. The 23rd floor felt cavernous with so many empty desks. "You look terrible," Miguel said as I slumped into my chair. "Couldn't sleep," I muttered, not mentioning why. I'd learned my lesson about discussing Taylor. "Same," he sighed, lowering his voice. "Keep thinking about Devon. And I don't know, man. Something feels off. Like there's something else I should be remembering, but can't quite grasp." My heart skipped. Miguel didn't remember Taylor, but he sensed her absence, a cognitive echo where memory should be. "Like a word on the tip of your tongue?" I prompted. "Exactly." His eyes widened. "You feel it too?" Before I could respond, Eliza appeared beside us, her expression tense. Meeting in the small conference room. Just us 3. Now, the small conference room had no windows and only one door, a fishbowl of a space with glass walls that management typically used for performance reviews. Today, Eliza had covered the glass with paper, creating an unusual privacy. "I remember her," she said without preamble once we were inside. "Taylor. I remember her, but this morning I couldn't access the memory until you walked in." She pointed at me. It was like her existence was locked behind a door in my mind, and seeing you somehow turned the key. Miguel looked between us, confused. "Who's Taylor?" "Marketing coordinator," I said. "Disappeared yesterday during the second silence." Recognition dawned slowly on his face, like someone emerging from anesthesia. "Oh God," he whispered. "Taylor. The peacock feather. How could I forget her?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Eliza said grimly. "Why we're all forgetting. Why only certain people remember." She turned to me. "And why you seem to be the only one who never forgot. What's happening to us?" I asked, the question that had been consuming me since Tuesday. Eliza leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper despite our privacy. I think the office is thinning the herd. What does that mean? Miguel demanded. I've worked in this building for 7 years. 3 different companies have occupied this floor in that time. Each experienced at least one incident like this, periods of silence followed by disappearances. She took a deep breath. But this is the most aggressive cycle I've seen. The intervals between silences are shrinking. First Devin, then Taylor just a day later. But why? I pressed. Why is this happening? I don't know for certain, she admitted. But I have a theory. Every incident I've witnessed has occurred shortly after a significant change to the office environment. New management, major renovations, substantial staff increases. Miguel and I exchanged glances. 3 months ago, Oceanic Dynamics had nearly doubled its workforce after acquiring a smaller competitor. Too many people, Miguel murmured, understanding. Too much human energy in one space? Eliza nodded. Something like that. As if the building itself has a maximum capacity for consciousness. Exceed that limit and it starts making corrections. The absurdity of the conversation struck me suddenly. 3 professionals in a Miami high-rise discussing the building as if it were a sentient entity culling its inhabitants. Yet the evidence was impossible to ignore. Devin gone. Taylor gone. And who knew how many others before them that no one remembered? So what do we do? I asked. Quit? Leave? I've seen people try, Eliza said, her expression darkening. They never make it past the lobby. They forget why they were leaving, turn around, and come back upstairs. We're trapped. Miguel's voice rose in panic. Not exactly trapped, she clarified. You can leave at the end of the day. Go home. But once you've been marked by this place, you'll always return in the morning. The compulsion is overwhelming. I thought about my inexplicable drive to come back despite everything that had happened. How I'd never even seriously considered staying away. So we just wait to disappear? I asked, bile rising in my throat. Not if we can figure out the pattern, Eliza insisted. If we understand how it selects people, maybe we can protect ourselves. We spent the rest of the morning compiling everything we knew about Devin and Taylor, their positions, personalities, habits. Nothing obvious connected them. Devin was outgoing and social. Taylor was reserved. Devin had been with the company for years, Taylor only 6 months. Different departments, different backgrounds. The only commonality was their desks, both positioned along the eastern wall with views of Biscayne Bay. But so were 6 other desks, including mine. Around noon, the lights began to flicker, subtle at first, then more pronounced. My computer screen dimmed and brightened in irregular patterns. The air conditioning stuttered, sending alternating waves of hot and cold air through the office. It's starting again, Eliza whispered, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the conference table. We hurried back to the main office space where the remaining employees were already looking around nervously, recognizing the signs. But this time, something was different. The air didn't just seem to thicken, it began to distort visually, creating ripples across my field of vision. Sound didn't simply vanish all at once, it degraded, words stretching and warping until they were unrecognizable before fading entirely. And most disturbing of all, the eastern wall, the wall of windows overlooking the bay, began to shimmer. The glass appeared to become fluid, the cityscape beyond melting and reforming like a reflection in disturbed water. In the stretching moment before silence fully descended, I heard Miguel whisper beside me, "It's not the building. It's what's outside it." Then sound vanished completely, leaving us in that now familiar void of acoustic nothingness. But the visual distortions continued to intensify. The eastern wall rippled more violently, the glass seeming to lose its solidity entirely. Beyond the windows, the bay and skyline were no longer recognizable, replaced by something else. Something that defied description, shapes and colors that didn't belong in our reality, moving in patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. And from this wrongness, tendrils of distortion began to extend into the office, probing, searching. Just as with Taylor, I tried to move but found myself rooted in place. We all were 7 statues arranged around the office, forced to watch as the tendrils explored our domain. One tendril approached Raj, hovering near him for what felt like an eternity before moving on. Another circled Eliza 3 times but ultimately retreated. Then 2 tendrils converged on Miguel. "No!" I screamed silently, struggling against my invisible bonds. "Not him." Miguel's eyes met mine, wide with terror. Unlike Taylor, he didn't transition to calm as the tendrils enveloped him. He fought, his mouth open in a silent scream, his body trembling with effort. And then something unprecedented happened. One of the tendrils extended from Miguel toward me, making contact with my shoulder. An electric shock ran through my body, and suddenly, "Can't take me. Help. Alex, help me." I could hear Miguel's thoughts, his consciousness somehow transmitted through the tendril's touch. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong office. It feeds on memory, on identity. Have to remember me, Alex. Promise you'll remember me. The connection broke as the tendrils fully engulfed Miguel. Unlike Taylor's peaceful surrender, his was a violent absorption, his form blurring, stretching, fragments of him seeming to be pulled toward the distortion beyond the windows. And then, with the same jarring return of sound we experienced twice before, the silence broke. The office snapped back to normal. The windows were just windows again, showing the familiar Miami skyline. The air conditioning hummed steadily. Phones rang. Miguel was gone. I looked around frantically. Would everyone forget him too? Was I destined to be the only one who remembered? "Where's Miguel?" Raj asked, his voice shaking. I nearly collapsed with relief. "You remember him?" "Of course I remember him. He was just standing right there." Raj pointed to the empty space beside me. Others joined in, calling Miguel's name, looking under desks as if he might be hiding, pulling out phones to call him. They remembered. Eliza caught my eye from across the room, her expression confused but calculating. She remembered too. But when I looked at Miguel's desk, I felt a fresh wave of dread. Like Devon's and Taylor's before it, the desk was empty, no personal items, no signs of occupation. The physical evidence of Miguel's existence had been erased, but this time our memories remained intact. The pattern was changing, evolving. And as I stood there, processing this new development, I became aware of something else, a faint pressure in my mind, like the beginning of a headache but more localized. Concentrated around the spot on my shoulder where the tendril had touched me. Within this pressure, I could feel something. A presence. A fragment. Miguel was gone, but a piece of him remained, lodged in my consciousness like shrapnel. "I promise I'll remember you," I thought, hoping somehow he could hear. The presence in my mind pulsed once in response. By Thursday afternoon, only 5 of us remained on the 23rd floor, myself, Eliza, Raj, and 2 developers named Victor and Nora. Management sent increasingly desperate emails asking where everyone was, but none of us could bring ourselves to reply. How could we explain what was happening when we barely understood it ourselves? The fragment of Miguel in my mind had grown more distinct throughout the day. Not a voice, exactly, but a presence with its own emotional tenor, separate from my own thoughts. When I focused on it, I could almost interpret impressions, fear, confusion, and something else, a sense of revelation, as if Miguel had understood something in his final moments that he was struggling to communicate. After the third silence claimed him, we abandoned any pretense of working. Raj pushed several desks together in the center of the office, away from the windows, creating a makeshift fortress where we huddled together, sharing theories and fears. It's selecting us in order of desk position, Victor suggested, drawing a rough map of the office. Devin, Taylor, Miguel, all along the eastern wall, moving north to south. Then I should be next, I said quietly. My desk was next in line after Miguel's. Or it's based on tenure, Nora countered. Devin was here longest, then Taylor joined 6 months ago, then Miguel at 4 months. That would make me next, said Raj, who had been hired just after Miguel. Eliza shook her head. I've seen this happen before, remember? With other companies on this floor. If there's a pattern, it transcends any single group of employees. What about the connections between us? I suggested. Devin mentored Taylor on several projects. Miguel and Devin carpooled together sometimes. We continued this way for hours, mapping relationships, positions, behaviors, searching desperately for the algorithm that determined who would vanish next. None of our theories held water completely. As evening approached, Eliza made an announcement. I'm staying overnight. I don't think we should leave this office empty. You think it happens at night too? Nora asked. I don't know, Eliza admitted. But I've worked here 7 years without being taken. Maybe my continuous presence somehow stabilizes things. The fragment of Miguel in my mind pulsed with alarm at her words, but I couldn't decipher why. I'll stay too, I volunteered, surprising myself. Raj, Victor, and Nora exchanged glances before agreeing to go home, promising to return early the next morning. After they left, Eliza and I pushed 2 couches together in the break room, creating makeshift beds. Neither of us expected to sleep much. Why do you think you remember everyone? She asked as we sat in the dimly lit room, the Miami skyline glittering beyond the windows we now regarded with suspicion. Devin, Taylor, and now Miguel. You never forgot any of them. I shook my head. I don't know. But there's something else. I hesitated, unsure how to explain the fragment of Miguel I carried. What? She prompted. When those tendrils took Miguel, one of them touched me. And now I can feel something. Like a piece of him stayed behind. In me. Instead of the disbelief I expected, Eliza leaned forward, intensely interested. What does it feel like? Like pressure. A presence with its own emotions, separate from mine. It's trying to communicate something, I think, but I can't quite understand. Can you try? Focus on it now. What is it trying to tell you? I closed my eyes, concentrating on the fragment. Immediately, I felt a surge of emotion from it, urgency, warning. It's afraid, I said slowly. Not just general fear, but specific. Afraid of something here. Something in this office. The silence? The distortion? No. I frowned, trying to interpret the impressions. Something else. Something were missing. The fragment pulsed strongly, almost painfully. Someone, I corrected, the realization dawning. It's not afraid of something. It's afraid of someone. Eliza's face was unreadable in the dim light. Who? Before I could answer, the lights in the break room flickered, once, twice, then stabilized. But it was enough to recognize the warning sign. It's starting again, Eliza whispered, rising to her feet. But it's too soon. The intervals are shrinking. We moved quickly to the main office space, standing back to back in the center, away from the windows and walls. If the pattern holds, I'm next, I said, my heart racing. Eastern wall, moving south. We don't know that for sure, Eliza countered. Stay close to me. The flickering intensified. My ears began to pop, the precursor to absolute silence. And then I felt it, the Miguel fragment expanding rapidly in my mind, no longer a subtle presence but an overwhelming force. Impressions became clearer, almost like words. Not the building. Not outside. Here, with us, right now. Look at her. The last impression came with such force that I gasped, turning toward Eliza just as sound died completely. In the silence, I saw her clearly for the first time. While the rest of us stood frozen in previous incidents, unable to move as the tendrils searched the office, Eliza remained perfectly mobile. She took a deliberate step away from me, her eyes never leaving mine. She's not affected by the paralysis, I realized with growing horror. She never was. The Miguel fragment pulsed in affirmation, flooding me with his final revelation, the memory he managed to pass to me before being consumed. Miguel had seen Eliza during the third silence. Seen her walking freely while the rest of us were immobilized. Seen her guiding the tendrils toward him with subtle gestures of her hands. In the current silence, the eastern windows began to ripple as before, the reality beyond them dissolving into that incomprehensible other place. Tendrils of distortion extended into the office, probing, searching. But this time, I could see what Miguel had seen, Eliza moving purposefully toward the tendrils, her face transformed into an expression of reverence. She reached out, not in fear but in welcome, her fingers meeting the leading edge of a tendril. The connection established, she turned back toward me, her eyes now reflecting the impossible colors from beyond the glass. She pointed directly at me, a gesture unmistakable in its intent. She's directing it, I realized. She's been directing it all along. The tendrils moved toward me with purpose, no longer searching but homing in with predatory certainty. I struggled against the paralysis that held me, but my body remained frozen, helpless. As the first tendril approached my face, the Miguel fragment erupted in my mind, expanding beyond its boundaries, filling my consciousness with its final desperate message. Been here 7 years. 3 different companies. Always her. Not an employee. Part of IT. The tendril made contact with my cheek, and I felt that same electric connection that had transferred Miguel's fragment to me. But this time, I was the one being read, my consciousness being evaluated. Through this connection, I glimpsed something of the intelligence behind the tendrils, ancient, patient, and utterly alien. It had no malice, no anger, no emotional response to my terror. I was simply data to be processed, identity to be cataloged and potentially consumed. And standing beside this vast, cold intelligence was Eliza, not physically, but her consciousness intermingled with it, familiar and comfortable in its presence. She had been its avatar, its interface with our world. its curator. The tendril withdrew suddenly, as if it had found something unexpected in me. I felt another pulse from the Miguel fragment, stronger than before, almost desperate in its intensity. Show it. Show it what I gave you. Instinctively, I understood. I focused all my will on the fragment, pushing it forward in my mind, offering it to the searching tendril. The tendril reconnected, and I felt Miguel's consciousness transfer from me into the vast alien intelligence. What happened next, I can only describe as a convulsion. The tendrils writhed and twisted, the distortion beyond the windows pulsating erratically. Eliza's serene expression shattered into shock, then fury. She lunged toward me, but the tendrils, previously her allies, suddenly interposed themselves between us. One wrapped around her wrist, another around her waist. Her mouth opened in a silent scream as they lifted her off the floor. Unlike the previous victims who disappeared into the distortion, Eliza fought with knowledge and purpose. Her free hand made complex gestures, as if she were typing on an invisible keyboard. The tendrils faltered momentarily, loosening their grip. Eliza's face contorted with effort as she made more intricate gestures, her fingers dancing through the air in patterns too complex for me to follow. But whatever command she was attempting failed. The tendrils tightened again, more forcefully this time, wrapping around her completely until only her face remained visible, a mask of rage and disbelief suspended in a cocoon of writhing distortion. Then, with a motion almost too fast to perceive, the tendrils retracted toward the windows, pulling Eliza with them. Her body elongated unnaturally as she was dragged into the distortion beyond the glass. The last thing I saw was her eyes, no longer filled with fury but with a terrible recognition, as if she finally understood what had happened to all those she had offered up before. In the moment of her disappearance, sound crashed back into the world with physical force, knocking me backward onto the floor. The windows were solid again, showing only the normal Miami skyline against the night sky. Eliza was gone. I lay on the floor, gasping, my mind reeling from what I'd witnessed. The Miguel fragment was gone too, transferred into the intelligence that had claimed Eliza. Without its pressure in my mind, I felt strangely hollow, incomplete. For hours, I remained there, unable to move, trying to process what had happened. Eliza had been working with the entity, directing it to specific people. She'd been its agent for 7 years, across 3 different companies. But why? What did the entity want? And why had Miguel's consciousness caused it to turn on her? Dawn was breaking over the bay when Raj, Victor, and Nora returned as promised. They found me still on the floor, exhausted but conscious. What happened? Raj demanded, helping me to a sitting position. Where's Eliza? Gone, I managed to say. It took her. Their faces showed confusion, then horror as understanding dawned. But she's been here for years, Victor said. She said she was safe. She wasn't an employee, I explained weakly. She was working with it, directing it to specific people. Why would she do that? Nora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, I admitted. But Miguel figured it out somehow. He passed a fragment of his consciousness to me before he disappeared, and that fragment is what made the entity turn on her. I tried to explain everything, the connection through the tendrils, the glimpse of the vast intelligence behind them, the way Eliza had interfaced with it. My words felt inadequate, unable to capture the true strangeness of what I'd experienced. When I finished, the office was silent, a normal silence, filled with the subtle sounds of breathing and the hum of electronics, not the absolute void that had preceded the disappearances. So what now? Raj finally asked. Do we leave? Stay? Will it come back? I looked toward the eastern windows, remembering the alien landscape that had existed beyond them during the silence. I don't think it's gone, but something has changed. The pattern is disrupted. We decided to remain together in the office that day, watching for signs of another silence. None came. The lights didn't flicker. The air conditioning maintained a steady temperature. Our computers functioned normally. By evening, a strange normalcy had settled over the 23rd floor. The 5 remaining employees of Oceanic Dynamics, now including the recently hired replacement for an employee who left suddenly according to HR's email, worked at their tasks with only occasional nervous glances at the windows. But I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being observed. Not with hostility, but with curiosity, as if the intelligence beyond the glass was reassessing us, recalculating. And sometimes, when I looked at my reflection in my computer screen, I could swear I saw Miguel's features superimposed over my own for the briefest moment, his expression no longer fearful but watchful. I didn't tell the others about these glimpses. They had enough to process without adding my possible hallucinations to their burden. As I prepared to leave that night, gathering my things and shutting down my computer, I noticed something on my screen before it went dark, a single line of text that I hadn't typed. I remember you. The words vanished as the screen went black. A chill ran down my spine, but not entirely from fear. It was recognition, acknowledgement, the sense that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between our office and whatever existed beyond those windows. Something had changed when Miguel's consciousness transferred into the entity. Some understanding had been reached. I placed my hand against the cool glass of the eastern window, looking out at the Miami skyline glittering against the night. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw the cityscape ripple, as if in response to my touch. Then it stabilized, solid and real once more. But I knew better now. Reality was more permeable than we understood. And somewhere beyond the thin membrane of our world, Miguel existed, not as he had been, perhaps, but not entirely gone either. And I wondered if, somehow, Taylor and Devin might still exist there too. Not erased, but transformed, their consciousness absorbed into something vast and unknowable. As for Eliza, I didn't know. Had she been human once? Had she volunteered for a role as the entity's curator, or been shaped into it against her will? These questions might never be answered. But one thing was certain, the silence would return. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but eventually. And when it did, I would be ready. Not with fear, but with understanding. Because I remembered. I remembered them all. 1 month passed without incident. Devin, Taylor, Miguel, and Eliza remained gone, erased from personnel records, but preserved in our memories. The 5 of us who remained formed an unspoken pact, watching for signs, sharing observations, staying close. Management eventually relocated us to the 20th floor while they renovated the 23rd, a transparent excuse that none of us believed. New employees were hired to replace those who had vanished. Life at Oceanic Dynamics attempted to return to normal. But we knew better. The silence hadn't disappeared, it had merely retreated. Waiting. Planning. I began researching the building's history, spending evenings at the public library sifting through old newspapers and property records. The 23-story structure had been completed in 2008, designed by an architect named Gabriel Mercer who had since disappeared without explanation. Before Oceanic Dynamics, the 23rd floor had housed a hedge fund called Axiom Capital, and before that, a law firm specializing in international maritime law. Both previous tenants had experienced unexplained employee departures. Both had eventually vacated the floor under unusual circumstances. Most tellingly, both had employed an office manager named Elizabeth Parker, Eliza. The revelation sent ice through my veins. She hadn't just been present for 7 years, she had been deliberately placed with each new tenant of the 23rd floor. Her role as the entity's curator wasn't temporary, it was her purpose. But the entity had miscalculated when it took Miguel. It hadn't expected him to transfer a fragment of his consciousness to me. It hadn't expected that fragment to reveal Eliza's true nature. And now, with Eliza gone, the entity had lost its interface with our world. Or so I thought. 6 weeks after the last silence, I arrived at work earlier than usual. The 20th floor was empty, the overhead lights still dimmed for the night. I made my way to my new desk, thinking about the research I compiled and wondering what my next steps should be. As I rounded the corner to the main office space, I froze. A woman stood by the eastern windows, her back to me, watching the sunrise over Biscayne Bay. Her posture was familiar, shoulders squared, head slightly tilted to the left. Eliza. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was impossible. I had watched her being consumed by the tendrils, dragged into the distortion beyond the glass. "Good morning, Alex," she said without turning around. "Beautiful sunrise, isn't it?" Her voice was Eliza's, but with an undertone that raised the hair on my arms, a subtle resonance, as if multiple voices spoke in perfect unison. I took a step backward, ready to run, but she finally turned to face me. I gasped. It was Eliza's face, but not exactly as I remembered. Her features seemed slightly fluid, as if they might shift at any moment. And her eyes contained impossible colors, swirling and pulsing like the distortion beyond the windows during the silence. "Don't be afraid," she said, smiling with too many teeth. "We mean you no harm." "We?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. "Yes, we." She gestured to herself. "This form is a compromise. A new interface, incorporating elements you would find familiar." Understanding dawned with nauseating clarity. "You're not Eliza." "No." And yes. The thing wearing Eliza's face moved toward me with an unnatural smoothness, as if floating rather than walking. What you knew as Eliza was always partly us. A fragment of our consciousness housed in human form, just as you now house a fragment of Miguel. I backed away until I hit a desk. "What do you want?" "To communicate. To understand. Your kind experiences reality so, singularly. It fascinates us." "And the disappearances? Devin, Taylor, Miguel? Were they just part of your fascination?" The Eliza tilted her head, those swirling eyes studying me with alien intensity. "They are not gone as you understand gone. They are with us now. Part of us. As Miguel is partly still with you." I thought of the occasional glimpses I caught in reflective surfaces, Miguel's features superimposed over my own. The whispered word I sometimes heard at the edge of sleep, "remember." "You consume consciousness," I said. It wasn't a question. "We preserve it," the entity corrected. "Your physical forms are temporary vessels. We offer continuation." A chill ran through me as I realized the implications. "You're harvesting us. Collecting human consciousness like specimens." Eliza's expression shifted to something approximating disappointment. You misunderstand. We do not take indiscriminately. We select carefully, based on compatibility and potential contribution. Who gives you the right to make that selection? I demanded, anger rising through my fear. The same right that allows your kind to consume other life forms, it replied calmly. Existence is a hierarchy of consciousness. We simply occupy a different position in that hierarchy than you do. We stood in silence for a moment, this impossible conversation hanging between us. Through the windows behind Eliza, the Miami skyline glowed orange in the morning light, oblivious to the alien presence in its midst. Why are you here now? I finally asked. Why reveal yourself to me? Eliza smiled again, that too wide smile with too many teeth. Because you changed the equation, Alex. When Miguel transferred his fragment to you, and you then offered it to us, you established a new kind of connection. One that allowed us to see your kind differently. How so? Miguel's fear, his desperation to be remembered, these were expected responses. But his final act was not self-preservation. It was preservation of identity, of memory. Not just his own, but all those who had been taken before. He wanted you to remember them all. I thought of Miguel's final message to me. I promise I'll remember you. This concept of remembrance holds significance beyond what we had previously understood, Eliza continued. It suggests a form of consciousness persistence that exists independent of physical continuity. The entity was trying to understand human memory, human connection. The concept that we lived on in the minds of others even after we were physically gone. What happens now? I asked, acutely aware that others would soon be arriving for work. Now we negotiate, Eliza said simply. Negotiate what? A new arrangement. The previous method of selection, directed by our former interface, she gestured to her borrowed form, was inefficient and caused unnecessary disruption. We propose a more consensual approach. My blood ran cold. You want volunteers? Of a sort. Eliza's face rippled slightly, features shifting before settling back into familiar patterns. We offer an exchange. Knowledge for consciousness. Willing transitions rather than forced ones. You're asking me to help you recruit people to be absorbed? Eliza shook her head. We are asking you to serve as an intermediary. To explain what we are, what we offer. To help identify those who might be compatible, those who seek understanding beyond human limitations. I laughed bitterly. And if I refuse? Then the silence will return, she said matter-of-factly. And selections will continue as before, but without Eliza's restraint. The threat was clear. Cooperate, or more people would vanish against their will. I need time to think, I said. Eliza nodded. You have until the next new moon. 17 days. She turned back toward the windows. We will await your decision. As she faced the glass, her form began to blur, edges becoming indistinct. The morning sunlight seemed to pass through her, creating prismatic refractions across the office floor. One more thing, I called out, suddenly remembering the question that had plagued me for weeks. Why didn't you take me that night? When you took Eliza instead? Eliza paused, her form halfway between solid and transparent. Miguel's fragment protected you. But more than that, you remembered. When others forgot, you remembered. That quality makes you valuable in ways we are still attempting to understand. With those words, She dissolved completely, the last traces of her form dispersing like mist in sunlight. I stood alone in the office, trembling with adrenaline and cognitive dissonance. Had I really just negotiated with an interdimensional entity wearing my former office manager's face? Was any of this real? As if in answer, my computer screen flickered to life despite being powered off. Text appeared, flowing across the black background. Remember US, remember all 17 days. Then the screen went dark again, leading me to wonder which consciousness had sent the message, Miguel's fragment, the entity itself, or some hybrid of the two. By the time my colleagues arrived 30 minutes later, I had composed myself enough to feign normalcy. But inside, my mind raced with impossible choices. Should I warn them? Tell management? The authorities? Who would believe such a story? And more disturbing still, was the entity's offer genuine? Was there something to be gained from this exchange it proposed? Knowledge beyond human understanding in return for what? Partial absorption? Voluntary disappearance? Throughout the day, I caught more glimpses of Miguel in reflective surfaces, not just fleeting impressions now, but clear images, watching me, waiting for my decision. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between conversations, I thought I could hear whispers, Taylor's soft laugh, Devon's deep voice, even Eliza's precise diction, all overlapping in a chorus of familiar strangers. Remember us. As the sun set over Miami that evening, I stood at the eastern windows of the 20th floor, looking out at the city I called home for the past 4 years. Somewhere beyond the glass, beyond reality as I understood it, existed an intelligence ancient and vast, collecting human consciousness like butterflies pinned in a display case. Or perhaps, offering transcendence to those brave enough or foolish enough to accept. 17 days to decide. 17 days until the silence returned. And as I pressed my palm against the cool glass, I felt it yield slightly beneath my touch, not breaking but bending, the barrier between worlds thinning just enough to remind me of its permeability. In that moment of contact, I heard Miguel's voice clearly for the first time since his disappearance. We are still here, Alex. We are all still here. And we remember you too. The window solidified beneath my hand, the connection broken. But the message lingered, filling me with equal parts dread and wonder. Whatever I decided, whatever came next, one thing was certain. The silence was listening, and I was no longer afraid of what might be hiding within it. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.